Good evening. Settle in. There is nothing to follow tonight, nothing to remember, nothing you will be asked about later. If you fall asleep in the first 10 minutes, the video has done its work. If you stay awake for 4 hours, that is also fine. Either way, you are in the right place. I want to begin with an hour rather than a person. You may know the hour. It arrives somewhere after 1 in the morning and before 4, and it does not announce itself. You are not in pain. Nothing has gone wrong. The house is quiet and the day is over, and there is no reason at all for you to be awake. And yet, you are awake, and your mind has quietly opened a document you did not ask it to open. It is a list. It is not a list of your failures. That would almost be easier, because failures are finished things, and finished things can be filed. This is a list of the things you began, the course you took 4 lessons of, the instrument in the cupboard, the business plan in a folder on a laptop you no longer use, the letter you drafted and never sent to a person who is now beyond reach of letters, the room you started to paint, the manuscript at 11,000 words, the conversation you opened and then let close, the apology that got as far as your mouth. None of these are catastrophes. Not one of them on its own would matter. That is precisely why they will not leave you alone. A catastrophe gets grieved. An unfinished thing just waits. I'm going to spend the next 4 hours with a man who had this list too. His was longer than yours. His was, in fact, one of the longest lists in the recorded history of human effort. And he is remembered as the greatest genius who ever lived. And near the end of his life, he wrote a short sentence in the margin of a notebook, in mirror writing, right to left, in his own private hand. And the sentence was a question, and the question was this: tell me if anything was ever done. His name was Leonardo, of the town of Vinci. We will get to him slowly. There is no hurry. The whole point of 4 hours is that there is no hurry. Chapter 2, and what we are actually going to do tonight. Let me tell you honestly what this is, so that your mind can stop working out what to expect and start letting go. This is not a biography that marches from birth to death collecting dates. There will be dates, because dates are restful, and because a real life has real corners. But the shape of tonight is not a timeline. The shape of tonight is a single question turned over slowly, the way you turn a stone in your hand in the dark. The question is this: what is actually happening in a mind that would rather understand a thing than finish it? That is a psychological question, not a historical one, and I want to be clear from the beginning that I am going to treat it as a psychological question with a historical body. The body is Leonardo. The question belongs to you. Along the way, I am going to bring in other people. Giorgio Vasari, who wrote the first account of Leonardo's life, and who is both indispensable and unreliable. And I will tell you which is which. Sigmund Freud, who in 1910 wrote an entire book about Leonardo, got a crucial word wrong, built a theory on the error, and yet arrived at something about the man that has never quite been dismissed. Bluma Zeigarnik, a young researcher in Berlin in the 1920s who noticed something about waiters and unfinished orders that explains your 1 in the morning list better than any philosophy ever has. Maria Ovsiankina, who worked in the same laboratory and found the other half of it. Kurt Lewin, who supervised them both, and later, quieter voices. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky on why we are so consistently wrong about how long things take. Randy Frost and Paul Hewitt and Gordon Flett on the difference between wanting to do something well and being unable to bear doing it badly, which turns out to be the whole difference. None of them will be introduced as authorities to be obeyed. They are company, and I will make you one promise. I am not going to tell you that Leonardo was secretly fine, that the unfinished work was a hidden triumph, that everything was really complete in some higher sense. That is the kind of comfort that dissolves the moment you are properly awake. And I have no interest in giving you a comfort that only works in the dark. What I think is true is more interesting than that, and I will get to it in the last hour. For now, it is enough to say that the man who finished almost nothing changed almost everything, and that the relationship between those two facts is not what you would expect, and is not a paradox, and is not a consolation. Breathe out. We are going to Tuscany. Chapter 3. A man without letters. He was born on the 15th of April, 1452, in or very near the hill town of Vinci, about 20 miles west of Florence. His father was Ser Piero da Vinci, a notary. His mother was a woman named Caterina, about whom the record says almost nothing with confidence. They were not married to each other, and they never became married to each other, and that single administrative fact set the shape of his entire life. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is usually mentioned in one sentence and then dropped, and it deserves better. In 15th century Florence, the notarial profession was effectively closed to illegitimate sons. Leonardo's father was a notary. His grandfather had been a notary. The family trade, the obvious life, the settled respectable path with a guild and a title and a predictable old age was closed to him at birth by a piece of paper that had not been signed. So was the university. Not formally, and not everywhere, but practically. The doors that opened onto Latin, onto Aristotle read in the original, onto the accumulated argument of the educated world, were doors that swung on the hinge of legitimate birth and family money and early tutoring. He got very little of that. He learned to read and write in the Tuscan vernacular. His Latin, which he taught himself much later in life with visible effort, remained poor. There are pages in his notebooks where he has copied out Latin vocabulary lists like a schoolboy, a man in his 40s, working alone. He gave himself a name for this: Homo senza lettere, a man without letters. He used it with a mixture of defiance and injury that anyone who has ever been the least credentialed person in a room will recognize instantly. And here is the first thing I want you to hold, because it will matter in about 3 hours. A man shut out of the received answers has to go and look. If you cannot read what Aristotle concluded about the flight of birds, you have two options. You can be ignorant, or you can go and watch birds for years with your own eyes and write down what they actually do. He chose the second. Not because he was nobler than the scholars, because the first door was shut. Almost everything extraordinary about Leonardo grows out of that shut door. He is the most original observer in the history of European art and science, partly because he was denied the second-hand knowledge that would have satisfied a luckier man. And almost everything unfinished about him grows out of the same door. A man who has to verify everything himself from the beginning, with no authority to defer to, will find that every question opens 4 more. He was not undisciplined. He was undersupplied, with permission to stop. Hold that. We will come back to it. Chapter 4. The workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. Somewhere around 1466, when he was 14 or so, his father placed him as an apprentice in the Florentine workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. I want to describe that workshop because the modern imagination gets it wrong. It was not a studio in the romantic sense, a quiet room where a sensitive man communed with a canvas. It was a small manufacturing business. Verrocchio's shop took commissions for whatever paid. Panel paintings, bronze casting, goldsmithing, tomb sculpture, terracotta, banners for tournaments, parade armor, theatrical machinery for civic festivals, bells. If a wealthy Florentine wanted an object made well, this was one of the places you went. An apprentice ground pigment. He prepared panels with layer after layer of gesso, sanded smooth. He learned to make brushes. He mixed plaster, drew from casts and from live models, and eventually was allowed to paint the parts of a picture nobody would look at closely. Cloth, foliage. A minor angel in the corner. 3 things happened to Leonardo in that shop that never stopped happening to him. The first is that he learned to work across materials. He was never trained as a painter who occasionally dabbled in engineering. He was trained in a shop where the same pair of hands cast bronze on Tuesday and painted drapery on Wednesday, and where nobody thought this was strange. The habit of moving between domains was not an eccentricity he developed, it was his professional formation. The second is that he learned to be extraordinary at the thing directly in front of him. There is a famous story, and it comes from Vasari, so treat it gently, that Verrocchio gave Leonardo an angel to paint in the corner of a baptism of Christ, and that when Verrocchio saw what the boy had done, he put down his brush and never painted again. The story is almost certainly embroidered. Verrocchio kept working. But if you stand in front of that panel in the Uffizi, the left-hand angel is visibly by another hand and visibly better, softer in the transitions, more alive in the turn of the head, and it is not sentimental to say so. Something arrived in that shop. The third thing is the one that matters tonight. He learned, in a workshop full of unfinished commissions and long projects and problems solved on the way, that a job is a process of investigation. And he never learned the other half of the trade, the half Verrocchio knew perfectly, which is that a commission is a contract with a delivery date and a client who will not wait forever. By 1472, he was registered in the Compagnia di San Luca, the Florentine painters' confraternity. He was independent, or nearly. He was 20 years old, and he was already the most gifted hand in the city. And he was about to begin the long habit of walking away. Chapter 5. The Adoration that Stayed Brown. In March of 1481, the monks of San Donato a Scopeto, just outside Florence, commissioned an altarpiece from him. The subject was the Adoration of the Magi. The contract was, by the standards of the time, generous and specific and a little anxious, which tells you something about his reputation already. He worked on it. He worked on it hard. And you can see exactly what he did, because it is in the Uffizi in Florence, and it has been there unfinished for 500 years. What survives is the underpainting, a monochrome ground, brown and gold, on which he has drawn and modelled the entire composition in tone, the Virgin at the centre, the kneeling kings, a crowd behind them in agitation, faces turning and craning, two figures at the edges who seem to belong to a different order of reality, one of them possibly a self-portrait. A ruin of architecture behind, and horsemen fighting or rearing in the middle distance, sketched in with a violence that has nothing to do with a nativity. It is one of the most exciting objects in the history of painting, and it is exciting precisely because it stopped where it stopped. You are looking at a mind in motion. The paint was never laid over the thinking, so the thinking is still visible. He never finished it. In 1482 or thereabouts, he left Florence for Milan, and the monks eventually gave the commission to somebody else, and that was that. Now, I could tell you this was a triumph. Museums do. Art historians, quite reasonably, treat the unfinished Adoration as more valuable to us than a finished one would have been, because it shows the process. And that is true. But I want you to notice what we just did. We took a broken contract, a group of monks who wanted an altarpiece for their church and did not get one, and a young man who took the money and the panel and left. And we reframed it as a gift to posterity. It is a gift to posterity. It is also a man not doing what he said he would do. Both things. Keep both. The whole night depends on your willingness to hold both. There was another panel around the same period, a Saint Jerome in the wilderness, now in the Vatican. The saint kneeling, gaunt, a lion at his feet. The neck and shoulder anatomy already worked out with a precision that would not be normal in European art for another century. Also unfinished. 2 major panels, 2 abandonments. He was not yet 30. And there is a third case from these years which I have saved, because it is the most extraordinary administrative story in the history of art, and almost nobody knows it. In 1483, shortly after arriving in Milan, he took a commission from the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception for the center panel of an altarpiece in the church of San Francesco Grande. He was to work alongside 2 brothers, Ambrogio and Evangelista de Predis, who would handle the side panels and the gilding. The contract was detailed. It specified the subject, the materials, the delivery date. He painted the Virgin of the Rocks, a Madonna in a grotto of grey volcanic stone, with an angel and 2 infants, and behind them a landscape of eroded rock and receding water, that no European painter had attempted, because it is not a landscape at all, it is a geological observation. It is one of the supreme paintings of the 15th century, and it is in the Louvre. And there is a second one, almost the same composition, colder, harder, with different faces and no pointing hand, and it is in the National Gallery in London, and it was painted years later, probably between the 1490s and about 1508. The reason there are two is a dispute about money that lasted a quarter of a century. What appears to have happened, from the surviving petitions, is that Leonardo and the de Paredes brothers considered the agreed payment inadequate for what had been delivered. The confraternity disagreed. Petitions were submitted. Arbitration was sought. The first painting appears to have left the arrangement entirely and gone to another buyer, possibly to Ludovico Sforza, possibly onward to France, which is how the Louvre has it. A second version had to be produced to satisfy the original contract. The matter was still being formally settled around 1508. 25 years. From the signing to the settlement, a quarter of a century of letters and hearings and delay about one altarpiece. I tell you this partly because it is funny, in the specific way that only very old bureaucracy is funny, and partly because it corrects something. The story of Leonardo not finishing is usually told as a story about his psychology alone. It was also, quite a lot of the time, a story about contracts and clients who did not want to pay, and the ordinary grinding friction of getting work out into the world through other people who have their own interests. Some of what is on your list is not on it because of your character either. Some of it is on it because a person did not reply, or a company reorganized, or the money did not come, and you have been filing that under personal failure for years when it belongs under other people. Chapter 6. The Letter to a Duke. Around 1482, he went north to Milan, to the court of Ludovico Sforza, and among his papers there survives a draft of a letter of self-recommendation, which is one of the strangest documents in his archive. You would expect a painter to write to a duke about painting. He does not. Or rather, he does, but he leaves it until nearly the end. The letter offers, in order, military engineering, portable bridges, methods for draining moats and for making scaling ladders, bombards that throw small stones like a hailstorm, ways to reach a besieged place by tunnel without noise, even under a river, armored vehicles, safe and unassailable, which can break any body of men, mortars of great beauty and utility, and, if a battle should be at sea, ships that can resist the heaviest cannon. Then, near the bottom, almost as an afterthought, he mentions that in time of peace he believes he can give satisfaction equal to any other in architecture, in the construction of buildings public and private, and in conducting water from one place to another. And that in sculpture, in marble, bronze and clay, and likewise in painting, he can do as much as anyone, whoever he may be. And then, last of all, he offers to undertake the bronze horse. Sit with the ordering of that letter. The greatest painter alive is applying for a job, and he lists painting 9th. in a subordinate clause in a sentence that begins with plumbing. There are two readings, and I think both are correct. The first is strategic. Ludovico Sforza was a ruler in a peninsula of shifting alliances and French ambition, and he did not urgently need another Madonna. He needed walls that held. Leonardo read the room. That is not naivety. That is a freelancer who understands his client. The second reading is the one that matters for tonight. He was not lying. The order of that letter is very close to the true order of his interests. He wanted to know how water moves, how a beam carries load, how a wing generates lift, how a heart valve closes, how a smile is produced in the muscles of a face. Painting was one of the places where the knowing came out. It was never the only one, and I am not certain it was the first one. A man like that does not abandon paintings out of laziness. He abandons them because the painting was a question, and the question got answered somewhere around the underdrawing, and the remaining months of laying colour into a contract were not the interesting part. That is not an excuse. The monks still had a bare wall. But it is, I think, an accurate description of a mind, and accuracy is the only kindness available here. Rest for a moment. In the next chapter, we go to Milan, and to a horse the size of a house. Chapter 7. What he actually did in Milan. He was in Milan for roughly 17 years, from about 1482 to 1499. Those are his 30s and 40s, the whole broad middle of an adult working life, and I want to tell you what he actually spent them on because the summary version is wrong. The summary version says he painted the Last Supper. He did. It took him about 3 years of that 17. Here is a fuller account. He designed court entertainments. In 1490, he staged something called the Festa del Paradiso for a Sforza wedding, an indoor spectacle in which the heavens opened, the planets appeared, and the whole mechanical apparatus of the cosmos turned above the heads of the guests, driven by machinery he had built. It was, by every account that survives, astonishing. It lasted one evening. Nothing of it remains except descriptions and some drawings. He entered the competition to design the Tiburio, the crossing tower of Milan Cathedral. He built a model. He wrote memoranda about the structural principles involved, comparing a sick building to a sick body and the architect to a doctor, which is a genuinely original piece of thinking about structural failure. He did not get the commission. He worked on ideal city plans, prompted by the plague that killed a large part of Milan's population in the 1480s. 2-level streets, the traffic above, the waste, and the carts below. Wide, ventilated, planned. Nobody built it. He designed war machines, as promised. Scythed chariots. A crossbow of enormous scale. A tank shaped like a turtle, with the drive gearing drawn incorrectly, possibly on purpose, possibly not. He studied light and shade with a rigor nobody had applied before, and the notes became part of the material Melzi would later assemble into a treatise on painting. He drew the human figure in proportion, and he studied a horse's anatomy in more detail than any European had, because of the monument I am about to describe. He wrote riddles and fables and jokes. There are pages of them. Some are quite bad, and he began and did not complete a great deal. Notice the shape of that list. Almost everything on it is either a preparation for something, or a performance that vanished the same night, or a proposal that was not accepted. He was for 17 years one of the most productive men in Europe, and if you asked what object you could point to at the end of it, the honest answer is one wall painting that was already deteriorating and a small number of portraits. I do not say this to diminish him. I say it because I think many of you recognize the pattern in a much smaller register. Years of real work, real hours, real skill applied, and the difficulty of pointing at a thing. That difficulty is not proof that nothing happened, but it does something to a man at 1 a.m. 2 more things about those 17 years, and both of them are about the kind of man he was to be near, which the list of projects does not tell you. The first is the music. According to Vasari and to another early account known as the Anonimo Gadiano, Leonardo went to Milan in the first instance partly as a musician. He was sent, or he presented himself, with a lyre he had made himself out of silver in the shape of a horse's skull, which he had designed that way for the sound. And the accounts say he played it better than anyone else present, and that he improvised and that he sang to it. Neither the instrument nor a note of the music survives. Of course not. It was improvised, and it was made of silver, and silver gets melted. But hold the image for a second, because it changes the picture of him. The most careful observational mind of the age arrived at the court of Milan as a performer, playing a self-designed instrument, extemporizing. Not a solitary, not a recluse in a tower. A man who could hold a room. The second thing is the household, and it is where the private life is. In 1490, a boy of about 10 came into the house. His name was Gian Giacomo Caprotti, and Leonardo called him Salai, which means something like little devil. Leonardo wrote a note about him within days of his arrival. The note lists in order that he is a thief, a liar, obstinate, and a glutton. There is an itemized record of things Salai stole, including money and a silver point stylus with the amounts. Salai stayed for 25 years. The account books record what Leonardo bought him: cloaks, hose, doublets, shoes in quantity, the way you buy shoes for a growing boy and then keep buying them for a young man with expensive taste. There are entries for a fine cloak with silver trim and for money handed over that was clearly not going to come back. And in the will, at the very end, in France, 30 years later, Salai gets half a vineyard. I find that the most humanizing material in the entire archive, and I want to name why. Because it establishes that this was not a man who abandoned things when they became difficult and unrewarding. He kept, for 25 years, at real expense, a person he had written down in his own hand as a thief and a liar, and provided for him in his will from the far side of a mountain range. Whatever the unfinished work means, it does not mean he could not sustain a commitment. He sustained an extremely inconvenient one for a quarter of a century without once, as far as the record shows, considering the alternative. Chapter 8. The Horse. The commission was for an equestrian monument to Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father, the mercenary soldier who had taken Milan and founded the dynasty. A bronze horse and rider, a standard genre. Verrocchio himself had made one, in Venice, of the Condottiere Colleoni, and Donatello had made the Gattamelata in Padua before that. Leonardo had grown up in the shop where such things were cast. He knew the trade. He decided to make the largest bronze equestrian monument that had ever existed. The scale is difficult to hold in the mind, so let me try. The horse alone, without the rider, was to stand something in the order of 7 meters high, 24 feet. Think of a 3-story house. Think of standing at the hoof and not being able to see over the knee. The quantity of bronze required was estimated in the tens of tons, and the surviving figures differ, and the honest position is that nobody is certain, only that it was a quantity of metal that a duchy would have to think seriously about. Casting a bronze of that size in one pour was, at the time, at the outer edge of what was technically possible, probably beyond it. He worked out how to do it anyway. There are pages in the notebooks of casting pits, of the armature, of the furnaces arranged around the mold, of how you get molten metal to travel far enough before it begins to set, of how you vent the gases so the whole thing does not explode. It is real engineering, worked at hard over years. And I want to name the thing I find most human in it, which is this. He did not have to make it that big. A normal-sized monument would have been paid for, cast, installed, and admired. He would have had a completed major public bronze in the centre of Milan by about 1490, and his reputation as a sculptor would have been secured for 4 centuries. He made it enormous because enormous was the interesting problem. That sentence is the hinge of his whole life, and it might be the hinge of yours. The scale of a project is very often chosen by the part of us that wants the problem to stay open. A manageable version of the thing would be finished by now, and then what would we think about at 1 a.m? Chapter 9. November 1493. By the winter of 1493, the clay model was standing. Not the bronze, the clay. The full-size model from which the moulds would be taken. It was unveiled in Milan in November of that year for the wedding celebrations of Bianca Maria Sforza and the Emperor Maximilian, and by every report it did what he had wanted it to do. People stood underneath it and were frightened by it. A horse the size of a building, modelled by the best hand in Italy in a city square in winter light. This was the high point. I want to mark it clearly because there was not another one quite like it. For a few months in his early 40s, Leonardo da Vinci had done the thing. Not finished it, but done the hard part. The part everyone said could not be done. The model existed. The engineering was solved on paper. What remained was the casting, which was terrifying and expensive, but which was in principle a known sequence of operations. All he needed was the bronze. Sit here for a second, in November 1493, with the clay horse standing and the metal not yet arrived. This is the position more people know than will admit it. The work is done, the proof is standing, and the last step depends on something outside you. Chapter 10. The metal that became cannon. In 1494, Charles VIII of France came over the Alps with an army. The Italian peninsula in those years was a set of wealthy, sophisticated, militarily inadequate states which had spent a century learning to hire other people to fight. A French army marching south changed every calculation in every court simultaneously. Ludovico Sforza, who had in fact encouraged the French to come and then discovered what that meant, needed guns. Bronze is what guns were made of. The metal that had been gathered for Leonardo's horse was sent to Ferrara to Ercole d'Este, Ludovico's father-in-law, to be cast into artillery. There is a draft in Leonardo's papers, part of a letter to Ludovico, in which he raises the matter of money and of the work, and then arrives at the horse and writes a line I have never been able to read calmly. Of the horse, he says, I will say nothing, because I know the times. I know the times. That is, a man in his 40s absorbing the fact that the largest thing he will ever make has been cancelled by history, and doing it in 9 words without complaint, with the particular dryness of someone who understands that complaint would be undignified and useless. It is worth saying plainly, the horse was not abandoned by Leonardo. This one was taken. Of all the unfinished things in his life, and there are many, and most of them are his own doing, the greatest single object was destroyed by a war. I think that matters for the psychology. It is very difficult to learn the lesson that you should finish things from a life in which the one time you nearly did, the bronze went to the cannon foundry. Chapter 11. The crossbowmen. In 1499, the French came again, this time to stay. Louis XII claimed Milan. Ludovico Sforza fled, was eventually captured, and died a prisoner in France. Leonardo left the city. The clay horse stayed. What happened to it is recorded in fragments, and the fragments agree on the essential fact. It was left standing in the Corte Vecchia, unroofed or badly sheltered, and Gascon soldiers of the occupying army used it for crossbow practice. Then weather did the rest. Clay that is not fired and not covered does not survive Lombard winters. Within a few years, there was nothing. Nobody made a drawing of the finished model. We do not know what it looked like. The greatest sculptural object of the 15th century exists only as preparatory sketches, contemporary astonishment, and the word enormous. I want to be careful here not to make this too neat. It would be easy to say the universe punished his ambition, and that is not true and not useful. Wars destroy things. Clay is fragile. Occupying soldiers are bored and have crossbows. There is no moral in it. But I will say this. If you are someone who has watched a piece of your own work destroyed by circumstances that had nothing to do with its quality, you have a companion in this story, and he was the best in the world. And it did not save him either. That is not a comfort exactly. It is company, which is sometimes better. Chapter 12. A method built to allow second thoughts. Between about 1495 and 1498, In the refectory of the Dominican convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, he painted The Last Supper. You know the image even if you have never looked at it. 13 men at a long table, the moment after a sentence has been spoken, the reaction travelling outward along the table in groups of 3 like a wave. It is, by wide agreement, one of the 2 or 3 most important paintings ever made in Europe, and its compositional intelligence is so complete that it reorganized what a painted narrative could do. And it is a ruin. It has been a ruin for most of its existence. Here is why, and the why is the whole point of tonight. A wall painting in 15th century Italy was made in fresco. You lay wet plaster on a section of wall, you paint into the wet plaster with pigment in water, and as the plaster cures, the color becomes chemically part of the wall. It is astonishingly durable. Frescoes from the 1300s are still on walls. But fresco has one absolute condition. You must finish the section that day while the plaster is wet. There is no coming back. There is no glazing, no soft blending over weeks, no adjusting a mouth in the 3rd month because you have thought of something better. You commit in a day to a patch and you move on. Leonardo could not work that way. Not, would not, could not. In the sense that the way he thought was incompatible with it. So he did not use fresco. He sealed the dry wall and painted on it with oil and tempera as if the wall were a wooden panel. This gave him exactly what he needed. He could stop, he could stand back for a week. He could return and soften an eyelid, deepen a shadow, change the angle of a hand. He could revise. It also meant the paint was sitting on the wall rather than in it. A Dominican named Matteo Bandello, who was a young man in that convent and later became a writer, left an account of watching him work. He described Leonardo arriving at first light, climbing the scaffold, and painting from sunrise to sunset without remembering to eat. And he described other days when Leonardo came in, stood in front of the wall with his arms folded, looked at it for 2 or 3 hours, made 1 or 2 strokes and left. Both of those men are the same man. That is not inconsistency. That is what it looks like when the thinking and the doing are the same activity, and the thinking is very slow and very good. And I should tell you what he was thinking about, because it is worth the detour, and because it explains why the ruin is worth defending from bombs. Every painter before him who had taken this subject had painted the institution of the sacrament, a calm table, a ritual. Christ blessing the bread, the apostles arranged in a row, composed, often haloed, with Judas placed alone on the near side of the table so you could identify the villain instantly. Leonardo painted a different moment. He painted the instant just after the sentence, "One of you will betray me," has been spoken out loud. So the picture is not a ritual. It is a room full of men who have just heard something unbearable 1 second in. He organized the reaction into 4 groups of 3, symmetrical about the center, and the reaction moves outward through them like a wave in water, which is, of course, exactly what he had been studying. Peter is already angry and has somehow already got a knife. Philip has both hands to his own chest, asking if it is him. Thomas has 1 finger raised. that same finger that will come back at the end of his life in the St. John. Two of them are talking to each other because they did not hear properly. One is turned entirely away, and Christ is the only still thing in the room, arms open, alone, with the light of the window behind his head and nobody touching him. The perspective of the whole painted architecture converges on a single point at Christ's temple. During the restoration, a small hole was found in the plaster at exactly that point, where he had put a nail in order to snap the lines from it. The mathematical center of the room is a nail in a man's head. Now the part that is pure psychological daring. Judas is not isolated. He is on the same side of the table as everyone else, sitting among them with no halo and no label and no snake and none of the medieval signage. He is in shadow, and he is reaching toward a dish at the same moment as Christ, and he is pulling back, which means you have to find him. For 500 years, everybody who has stood in front of that wall has had to scan a group of ordinary men and work out which one it is. That is the traitor placed inside the group, indistinguishable, and the viewer made to do the identifying. Nobody had ever done that, and it is the single most modern thing in 15th century painting. Vasari reports that the prior of the convent complained to Ludovico Sforza about how long it was taking, and that Leonardo explained he was still looking for a face for Judas among the criminals in a rough quarter of the city, and that if he could not find one, he would use the priors. That story may not be true. It has the shape of a story people tell. I pass it to you labeled. Vasari also says that he left the head of Christ unfinished because he did not believe he could conceive a face of sufficient divinity. That too is reported rather than documented, and given the state of the surface, we cannot now check it. But hold the possibility for a moment, because it belongs to tonight. The most important face in the most important painting in Europe, deliberately left undone, because the man did not think he could do it. He needed a method that let him think in front of the work. The method he invented for that reason is the reason the work is dying. Chapter 13. And he watched it begin to die. This is the part that people rarely put together, and it is the part that keeps me up. The Last Supper did not fail after he was safely dead. It began to fail while he was alive. In 1517, 2 years before Leonardo died, a churchman named Antonio de Beatis travelled through Italy as secretary to a cardinal, and he saw the painting, and he recorded in his journal that it was most excellent and that it was beginning to spoil. 19 years after it was completed, and Leonardo was still breathing, in France, in the service of the king, with the drawings and the notebooks around him. He knew, he must have known, he was the most acute observer of material behavior in Europe. He had spent his life watching how substances move and settle and separate. He would have understood, probably before anyone else did, exactly what was happening on that refectory wall in Milan and why, and that it was because of a decision he had made deliberately in order to be able to think slowly. By the time Vasari saw it in the 1550s, it was so far gone that he described it as reduced to a blur, a muddle of blots, nothing clearly visible. Later centuries did the rest. A door was cut through the bottom of it, The room was used as a stable and flooded. Napoleon's troops were quartered there. In 1943, a bomb took the roof off the refectory, and the walls survived behind sandbags by luck. The Great Restoration that finished in 1999, led by Pinin Brambilla Barcelon over 21 years, removed centuries of other people's repainting and stabilized what was left. What is on that wall today is roughly, by careful estimate, a minority of Leonardo's own paint. The rest is absence, held together and made legible. So here is the shape of it. The most influential painting in the Western tradition is a fragment, and it is a fragment because its maker needed permission to change his mind, and he built that permission into the physical chemistry of the object. And the object has been dying of it for 500 years. I am not going to draw the moral yet, but notice the exchange he made, because you have made a version of it. The freedom to keep the thing open, traded against the thing's ability to last. Chapter 14. The years of no fixed wall. He left Milan at the end of 1499, at 47 years old, with no patron, no completed monument, and a reputation that was somehow still enormous. He went first to Mantua, where Isabella d'Este, one of the most determined art collectors who has ever lived, tried for years to get a painting out of him and failed, in a correspondence that is quietly comic if you have ever chased a contractor. Then to Venice, where he advised on defences against the Ottoman threat and proposed, among other things, flooding a river valley as a military measure. Then back to Florence, which he had left as a young man and returned to at nearly 50. He travelled in those years with Luca Pacioli, the Franciscan mathematician. And I want to stop on Pacioli, because it is important that tonight is not dishonest. Pacioli wrote a book called De Divina Proportione, on proportion, published in Venice in 1509. Leonardo drew the illustrations. 60 polyhedra, rendered in a way nobody had managed before, drawn as skeletal open forms so that you can see through the solid and understand its structure, hanging as if suspended in space. He finished those. They were delivered, printed, published, and they are still the best thing of their kind ever done. So, the man was capable of completing work to a deadline for a colleague he respected on a project that was not primarily his. Hold on to that. Any theory of Leonardo that says he simply could not finish is refuted by a mathematics textbook. Then, in 1503, he took on the Arno. The plan, which he pursued alongside Niccolo Machiavelli, then a Florentine official, was to divert the river Arno, partly as a military measure against Pisa and partly as a permanent canal that would make Florence a port. Digging actually began. Thousands of workers. It was attempted. It was too much for the technology and the money available. The trenches collapsed and filled, and it was abandoned. The largest civil engineering project of his life actually begun in the actual ground, abandoned. And around the same time, in the same city, he began a portrait of a woman who was probably Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. We will come to her. There is one more employment in those years, and it is the one people find hardest to accept. In 1502, He took service as a military architect and engineer with Cesare Borgia. Borgia was the son of Pope Alexander VI, and he was in the process of taking the Romagna by force, and his methods were what you would expect of a man whom Machiavelli would shortly hold up as the model of effective ruthlessness. Machiavelli, incidentally, was also in Borgia's orbit at the same moment, on a Florentine diplomatic posting, and it is likely the two of them were in the same rooms. Leonardo travelled through central Italy with that campaign, inspecting fortifications, surveying, advising on defences, and in Imola, in the winter, he made a map. You should look it up in daylight, because it is at Windsor, and it is beautiful, and it does not look like a 15th century map. It looks like something from a modern planning office. It is a true overhead plan, drawn as though from directly above at a uniform scale, every street and block and the shape of the walls, with a circle of wind directions around it like a compass rose. Maps before this were pictorial. They showed towns in a kind of raised oblique view, with little buildings drawn in elevation, because that is how a town looks to a person. Leonardo drew what a town looks like to nobody. He drew the plan as an abstraction, measured from a viewpoint no human being had ever occupied. He surveyed it, it is generally thought, by pacing the streets with a measuring instrument and taking bearings, and then constructed the impossible viewpoint mathematically. That is the modern city map, invented in a war, for a man who wanted to know where to put the guns. And while he was doing all of this, Isabella d'Este in Mantua was still waiting for her painting. And I want to give you one document from that correspondence, because it is the single most useful contemporary sentence about him that exists. In 1501, her agent in Florence, a friar named Pietro da Novellara, wrote back to her to report on the prospects. He told her that Leonardo's manner of life was changeable and undetermined in the extreme, so that he seemed to live from one day to the next. He reported that Leonardo was working hard at geometry and had become extremely impatient with the paintbrush. That is not Vasari 50 years later. That is a man in the room writing to a client in the present tense, trying to explain why the picture is not coming. Live from one day to the next. Impatient with the brush. Working hard at geometry. He was not idle for a single hour of those years. He was simply not working on what he had been asked to work on. And there is a version of that in your life too. And it is worth knowing that it has never been rare. Chapter 15. What the notebooks physically are. I want to describe the notebooks as objects, because the phrase Leonardo's notebooks has become so smooth with use that it has stopped meaning anything. They are not a set of matching volumes on a shelf. They are a chaos. He wrote on loose sheets, on small pocketbooks he carried at his belt, on large folio pages, on scraps. He wrote on both sides. He turned a page 90 degrees and wrote in the margin. He came back to a sheet years later and added something in a different ink next to an unrelated drawing, upside down. A single page can carry a study of a horse's hind leg, a geometrical proof, a shopping list, a note about a debt, a caricature of a man with a heavy jaw, and one line of something close to poetry. Estimates of the total vary and should be treated as estimates. The commonly cited figure is that he wrote something on the order of 13,000 pages and that around 7,000 survive, which means that roughly half of it is gone, and the surviving half is the largest and strangest body of private thought left by any individual before the modern era. After his death, they went to Francesco Melzi, his student and companion, who kept them carefully at the family villa in Lombardy for 50 years. After Melzi died, his heirs did not understand what they had. Sheets were sold, given away, and stolen. A sculptor named Pompeo Leone acquired a great many and did something that makes art historians put their heads in their hands. He cut them up. He separated the drawings from the writing and pasted them into new albums organized by subject, because he thought that would be tidier. What we have now is scattered across Milan, Paris, London, Madrid, Windsor, Turin, and one volume, the Codex Leicester, which was bought at auction in 1994 by Bill Gates for a little over $30 million. Now, here is the sentence that matters. He did not publish one of them. Not one. Not the treatise on painting, which existed as a heap of notes that Melzi assembled after his death. Not the treatise on water, which he planned in detail and never wrote. Not the anatomy, which was to be the great work. Not the mechanics, not the optics, not the flight. For roughly 40 years, the most capable mind in Europe wrote down what it found, in a private hand, in a form nobody else could easily read, and then did not tell anybody. Consider what that cost. Not him, us. The circulation of the blood, the fossil record, the mechanics of the heart valves, the true structure of the human interior, the behavior of moving water, the principles of stratification. Some of these had to be found again by other people, in some cases 300 years later, because the man who found them first put the page in a drawer. That is the single largest unfinished thing in the history of thought, and it did not look like a failure from the inside. From the inside, it looked like a very productive Tuesday. Chapter 16. Writing right to left. He wrote backwards, right to left, the letters reversed, so that you need a mirror to read him comfortably. The romantic explanation is secrecy. A man with dangerous ideas, hiding them from the church or from competitors in a private cipher. That explanation is almost certainly wrong, and I want to correct it gently because the true explanation is better. He was left-handed. If you are left-handed and writing left to right with a quill and iron gall ink, your hand travels across what you have just written through wet ink, and the page smears and your hand blackens. If you write right to left, your hand moves away from the wet line. It is a practical solution, arrived at early and kept. And we know it was not primarily secrecy, because when he wrote to be read by somebody else, he wrote normally. But here is the part that is not merely practical, and this is the psychology of it. If your default mode of writing is a mode that only you can comfortably read, then the act of writing is not the act of communicating, it is the act of thinking. Every page is addressed to himself. There is no reader on the other side of it, and therefore no obligation to be finished, no obligation to be coherent, no obligation to arrive. Kurt Lewin, who we will meet properly later, had a way of talking about tension systems that applies here. A thought written to a reader is under pressure to resolve. A thought written to yourself can stay open indefinitely, and it will, because nothing is closing it. He built a workspace with no exit. I want you to consider, without any judgment at all, whether you have done something similar. A notes app nobody will see. A journal, a folder called Ideas. There is nothing wrong with any of it, and the private page is one of the great instruments of a thinking life. But it is worth knowing what it is. It is a place where things can be true without ever having to be finished. And since we are inside the private pages, let me show you what else is in there, because it is not all heart valves and vortices. There are fables, short ones, a paragraph or two, in the manner of Aesop, but stranger and bleaker. A stone that is bored of lying in a quiet high place, and rolls down to join the pebbles on the road, and is then crushed and kicked by every passing cart for the rest of time. A moth that admires a flame. A cedar that grows so proud of its height that it is chosen for the axe. There are riddles, which he called prophecies, and they are a specific kind of joke. They are written to sound like the end of the world, and they turn out to describe something ordinary. He will describe, in the voice of Apocalypse, creatures that will be seen fighting one another with terrible fury and enormous wounds, and the answer is cats. Or he will foretell that men will speak with men who neither hear nor see, and shall answer them, and the answer is letters. He wrote hundreds of these. Nobody commissioned a single one. There is a note among the emblems and devices about obstinate rigour, which appears to have been something like a personal motto, and which is a lovely thing to find in the papers of a man everyone accused of having no persistence. And there is the food. From at least 1515, there is external evidence that he did not eat meat. A Florentine traveller named Andrea Corsali, writing home from India to Giuliano de' Medici, described a people there who would not eat anything containing blood and would not permit harm to any living thing, and he added, as a point of reference his reader would recognize, like our Leonardo da Vinci. That is a passing remark in somebody else's letter about somewhere else, and it is the best kind of evidence because nobody was making a point. Vasari adds a story that he would buy caged birds in the market in order to open the cage and let them go, and that one is reported rather than documented, and I will pass it to you labelled as such, because it is too good to leave out and not solid enough to assert. The reason I am giving you the fables and the birds is this. The mind we have been describing, which could not close a commission and which carried a portrait over the Alps, was also a mind that spent its own unpaid time making up riddles about cats and refusing to eat animals. He was not an engine of thwarted productivity. He was a person with a sense of humour in a house with a difficult young man and some birds. Chapter 17. Water. If you had asked him at 60 what he was working on, I suspect the honest answer would have been water. It runs through everything. The Codex Leicester is largely water. He watched rivers cut banks and deposit silt, and understood erosion and sedimentation as a single continuous process, which is essentially correct and was not the standard view. He looked at fossil shells high in the hills of Tuscany and concluded, against the reading of Genesis that was general at the time, that these were the remains of creatures that had lived in a sea that had been there, and that the land and the sea had changed places over unimaginable stretches of time. That is deep time. That is stratigraphy. He is roughly 3 centuries early. He drew vortices, page after page of them. Water going around a pier, water falling into water, the curls and the counter-curls, the way a stream divides at an obstacle and reunites. He drew the same phenomenon dozens of times because each drawing showed him something the last one had not. And here we arrive at a distinction that I think is the most useful thing I can give you tonight, so I am going to say it plainly and then leave it alone for a while. There are 2 kinds of work. There is work with a terminal state, a wall painted, a book printed, a horse cast, you can be done. And there is work with no terminal state. Understanding how water moves, there is no page at which water is finished. Leonardo's tragedy, if it is one, is not that he was lazy or scattered, it is that he applied the mind of the second kind of worker to commissions of the first kind. He took contracts with delivery dates and treated them as investigations without end. You may have done this. It is worth asking, at some point when you are more awake than you are now, which of the things on your 1 in the morning list are actually of the first kind and which are of the second, because the second kind is not unfinished. The second kind was never going to finish, and the guilt attached to it is a category error, and you have possibly been paying that guilt for years on a debt that does not exist. 2 more water stories before we leave it, and one of them is about the moon, and it is the most beautiful thing in the notebooks. There is an old puzzle about the crescent moon. When the moon is a thin, bright crescent, you can sometimes see the rest of the disk, faintly, as a dim, grey circle completing the shape. In English, it used to be called the old moon in the new moon's arms. It had been noticed forever and never explained. In the Codex Leicester, Leonardo explains it. He reasons that the dark part of the moon is not dark. It is being lit, faintly, by sunlight that has bounced off the Earth. Our planet, catching the sun, throws light back into space, and some of it lands on the moon, and that is what you are seeing. He is right. That is Earthshine, and it is the correct explanation, and he had it around 1510. He goes further and says that the reflecting is done chiefly by the oceans, because water reflects, and here he was mixing correct and incorrect ideas, since he also believed the moon itself had seas on it. He was wrong about that. He was right about the mechanism. I want you to picture the act itself. A man in his late 50s, at night, looking up at a crescent moon, seeing the faint ghost of the rest of it, and working out that what he is looking at is the light of his own planet reflected off the sea, arriving on the moon and coming back. That is what he did, instead of finishing the paintings. I have said that this had a cost, and it did, but that is what he was doing. The other story is a bridge. Around 1502, he wrote to the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II, offering, among other things, to build a bridge across the inlet at Constantinople that is called the Golden Horn, not a bridge on piers, a single arch, one span, roughly 240 meters, which would have made it by a very long way the largest single span in the world and would have remained so for centuries. The letter survives. It was found in the Ottoman archives in the 1950s. It was never built. Of course, it was not. And then, in 2001, an artist named Vebjorn Sand built it, at a smaller scale, as a pedestrian bridge in Norway, from the drawings. And it stands, and people walk over it. 500 years is a long lead time on a commission, but the design was sound and somebody eventually did it, and the loop is closed. Sleep on that one. I mean it literally. Chapter 18. Flight. He wanted to fly, and I mean that in the plain sense, not as a metaphor. He wanted a man to leave the ground. The Codex on the Flight of Birds, a small notebook now in Turin, dates from around 1505. It is a study of how birds actually stay up, not how they flap, how they stay up. He watched the way a bird uses the wind against itself, the way it turns to lose or gain height, the way the primary feathers separate on the upstroke and close on the down, the way a bird descends by presenting less to the air. He worked out the principle of the center of pressure moving. He grasped that air, like water, is a fluid that a body works against, and that the resistance of the fluid can hold a weight up if it is presented correctly. He designed machines. The ornithopter, with a man lying prone in a frame, working wings by pedals and cranks. The aerial screw, which people like to call a helicopter, and which would not have flown. The pyramidal parachute, which was tested 500 years later and does in fact work. He wrote a note in the margin about the great bird taking its first flight from the back of the great swan, which appears to mean Monte Cesare, a hill near Fiesole, whose name relates to the word for swan. It reads like a plan. There is no evidence a flight ever happened. There is a possibility, discussed but not established, that an assistant attempted something and was injured. None of the machines flew. And yet the physics he wrote down was, in its essentials, the physics that would eventually work, and he had it 400 years before anyone left the ground. Here is what I find remarkable, and it is a point about you and not about him. He failed at the goal and succeeded at the understanding, and he had no way of knowing that the understanding was the valuable part. He could not know. Nobody could have told him. He died believing, as far as we can tell, that he had not got the man off the ground, and he was right about that, and completely wrong about what he had done. That is not an argument that all your unfinished things are secretly valuable. Most unfinished things are just unfinished. But it is a real and documented case of a man being the worst possible judge of his own life's worth, and it should make you slightly more careful about the confidence of your judgment at 1 a.m. Chapter 19. The rooms where he worked at night. I am going to talk about the anatomy now, and I am going to do it gently, because you are lying in the dark, and I have no interest in disturbing you. In the first decade of the 1500s, he began dissecting human bodies. In one note, he mentions having opened more than 10. In a later one, more than 30. He worked in the mortuaries of hospitals, principally Santa Maria Nuova in Florence and later in Rome. At night, by candle, alone or nearly alone, in conditions I will not describe, because describing them serves nothing. I want to say only this about the physical reality of it. It was unpleasant, it was cold, it was frightening, and he did it for years, in his 50s and 60s, without being paid for it, without any institution asking him to, and without a publication to show for it. He did it because he wanted to know what was in there. The results are at Windsor, in the Royal Collection, on around 600 sheets. The set, known as Anatomical Manuscript A, from about 1510 and 1511, contains roughly 240 separate drawings and thousands of words of notes, and specialists in the field have said, repeatedly and without much hedging, that some of those drawings were not equaled for 400 years. He drew the bones of the shoulder from 4 angles and then exploded the view so you could see the layering. He worked out the muscles of the neck as a system of cables under tension. He drew the spine correctly with its curves, which nobody had. He drew a fetus in the womb in a way that is still reproduced in textbooks, and he got parts of it wrong, and I will say that too, because a man who is only allowed to be right is not a person, he is a monument. There was a collaborator, Marcantonio della Torre, a young professor of anatomy at Pavia, brilliant by all accounts, with whom Leonardo planned a great illustrated book on the human body. Between the two of them, the anatomist and the greatest draftsman alive, it would have been the founding text of the field. Della Torre died around 1511, young, probably of plague, and the book stopped. I want you to hear that clearly, because it is a specific and recognizable kind of loss. Not a project you gave up, a project that died because the other person died. If you have ever had a thing that only existed in the space between you and one other person, and then that space closed, you know the particular flavor of this. It is not guilt. There is nothing to be guilty about. It is stranded work, and it stays stranded. He kept dissecting for a few years after that. Then a complaint reached the Pope in Rome that this Florentine was interfering with corpses, and access was closed, and that was the end of it. And before the heart, one very small thing, because the small things are where he is most impressive, and they never make the documentaries. He worked out friction. Somewhere in the notebooks there are experiments with weights being dragged along surfaces by cords over pulleys, and out of them he arrives at 2 conclusions: that the resistance is proportional to the weight pressing the surfaces together, and that it does not depend on how large the area of contact is, which is deeply counterintuitive and which almost nobody guesses correctly the first time. Both are, to a good approximation, the laws of dry friction. They are usually credited to Guillaume Amontons, who published them in 1699. Leonardo had them about 200 years earlier, in a private notebook in mirror writing. He also drew ball bearings and roller bearings, and he understood that a rolling element between two surfaces defeats sliding friction, and he drew a thrust bearing with balls held apart in a race so that they do not rub against each other, which is the actual solution used in every bearing in your house. None of it was published. All of it had to be found again. I raise it because friction is the least glamorous subject in physics, and it is the one that governs everything that moves, and it is a useful emblem for the whole of him. He was not only reaching for flight and cathedral domes and the end of the world in chalk, he also spent an afternoon dragging a weight across a board with a string carefully 40 times, writing down the numbers, and got it right, and told nobody. That is what genius mostly is, incidentally, not the vision. The 40 careful repetitions of a boring measurement done by somebody who could not stop wondering. Chapter 20. The heart and a glass model. Let me give you the single best example of what he actually was, and then we will slow down again. He wanted to know how the heart works. Everyone at the time worked from Galen, the 2nd century Greek physician whose account had been authoritative for 1300 years. Galen said certain things about the heart that were wrong. Leonardo looked instead. He established that the heart is a muscle, not a furnace, not a seat of spirit, a muscle that contracts. He established that it has 4 chambers, not 2, which contradicted the received account. He described the trabeculae, the muscular bands inside the ventricle. He worked out that the heart's own supply comes through the coronary vessels. And then he did something that I find genuinely moving. He wanted to understand how the aortic valve closes so perfectly, with no leak, millions of times, without a mechanism telling it to. So he took an ox heart, made a cast of the aortic root in wax, and from the wax cast had a glass model made. Then he pumped water through the glass, with grass seeds suspended in it, and he watched where the seeds went. He saw that the water coming out of the heart formed vortices in the small pouches above the valve, and that those vortices pressed the 3 flaps of the valve shut from behind. The closing of the valve is not muscular. It is done by the swirl of the blood itself. He was right. It took the invention of magnetic resonance imaging in the 20th century for the profession to see that swirl again and confirm it. A man in a cold room with an ox heart, some glass and grass seeds in about 1513, and he did not publish it. I keep saying that, and I am going to keep saying it, because the enormity of it does not land the first time. Everything I have just described sat in a private notebook, in a private script, for 300 years, while physicians killed patients on the basis of Galen. That is the cost of the unfinished. Not always, not usually, but sometimes. And here it was very high, and it was paid by strangers who never knew. 2 companion pieces to that, and then we will move to the woman. The first is the eye. He worked for years on how vision happens, on the behavior of light through an aperture, on the darkened room with a small hole in the shutter, which throws an inverted image of the world onto the opposite wall. He described that room and understood it as an analogue of the eye, and he grasped that the eye receives rather than emits, which was not universally agreed. He got things wrong too. He struggled with the inversion of the image and reasoned his way around it by supposing a second refraction that does not happen. He was working without a theory of the retina, in the dark, on the hardest problem in perception, and he was wrong in an interesting direction. And he understood something practical that no painter before him had put into words. That we do not see sharply except in a narrow cone, and that the edges of a scene arrive to us soft, and that therefore a painting with every edge equally crisp is not realistic, but the opposite. That is the intellectual basis of sfumato. The blur is not decoration. It is optics. The second companion piece is the most reproduced drawing in the world, and it is not a picture. The Vitruvian Man, drawn around 1490, now in Venice, is a page from a notebook. A naked man in two superimposed positions inside a circle and a square, with dense mirror writing above and below. Everyone treats it as an emblem of Renaissance humanism, which it has certainly become, but look at what it actually is. Vitruvius, the Roman architect, had claimed in his treatise that the proportions of the human body fit both a circle and a square. Painters and architects had repeated the claim for centuries. Leonardo did what he always did. He tested it. And it does not work. Not as Vitruvius stated it. You cannot inscribe a man in a circle and a square using one shared center. So he solved it. He used two centers. The navel is the center of the circle. The base of the trunk is the center of the square. And the man has to move, arms and legs shifting between two positions, which is why there are 4 arms and 4 legs, and why the drawing has that strange animate quality, as though the figure is breathing. It is a working note. It is a man checking somebody else's arithmetic and finding a fix on a page addressed to himself in reversed handwriting. The most famous image of the human being ever made is a private correction. Chapter 21. The woman he did not hand over. Around 1503, in Florence, he began a portrait. The sitter was most probably Lisa Gherardini, in her 20s, the wife of a Florentine silk merchant called Francesco del Giocondo. A commission from a well-off tradesman for a picture of his wife, ordinary. The kind of job that pays the rent. He worked on it for years. Vasari says 4. Modern examination of the paint suggests it may have been longer, on and off, and that he was still touching it in the 15 teens. The technique is the reason. He built the flesh out of glazes so thin that recent X-ray fluorescence work at the Louvre has counted, in places, on the order of 30 separate translucent layers, some of them a couple of micrometers thick. Micrometers. Thinner than you can conceive of, applying deliberately. Each layer dried before the next went on. That is not painting as a job. That is painting as a decades-long argument with the behavior of light. and the effect it produces, which is called sfumato, smoke, is the reason the face will not resolve. The corners of the mouth and the corners of the eyes are held in a softness that never commits to an expression, and so your visual system keeps trying to settle it and cannot, and the sensation of that failure is what everyone in the world calls the mystery of the Mona Lisa. It is not a mystery. It is an unresolved edge, deliberately made by a man who understood peripheral vision better than his own century did. Now, the fact I care about tonight, he never gave it to Francesco del Giocondo. There is no evidence the man ever received the portrait of his wife. Leonardo kept it. He kept it for perhaps 16 years. He carried it out of Florence and to Milan and to Rome and over the Alps into France, and it was in his house at Amboise at the end where the Cardinal's secretary saw it in October 1517 and noted a portrait of a Florentine lady done from life. He never signed it. He never dated it. Vasari, writing later, said he left it unfinished. The single most famous painted object in human history is an undelivered commission that its maker regarded as incomplete and would not let go of. I do not have a lesson for that. I have only the observation, and I think you should hold it for a moment before we move on, because it is very strange, and we have all stopped noticing how strange it is. The thing he could not finish is the thing you cannot stop looking at. And while we are on the subject of what survives and what does not, 2 footnotes about the shape of his estate, because they say something about how strange the accounting is. The first is the leader. Somewhere between about 1504 and 1510, he painted a Leda, a standing female figure with a swan from the Greek story. It was seen, it was described. Copies were made by other artists, and several of them survive, and his own preparatory drawings survive, and from them you can tell that it was one of the major works of his life. The painting itself is gone, not damaged, gone. It is not in any collection, and nobody knows what happened to it. It may have been destroyed deliberately at some point on grounds of decency. It may simply have rotted or burned in some house in France. So the ledger of his life contains not only unfinished things, but finished things that have vanished entirely, and we only know they were finished because other people copied them. The second footnote is the strangest thing that has happened to his reputation in my lifetime. On the 15th of November 2017, a painting called Salvator Mundi, a Christ holding a crystal orb, sold at auction in New York for $450 million. It remains the highest price ever paid for a painting. It was sold as a Leonardo. Whether it is, one is genuinely disputed among specialists and has been from the beginning. The panel is heavily damaged and heavily restored, and the question of how much of the surface is his hand, how much is his workshop, and how much is a modern restorer is a live argument among serious people. Its whereabouts since the sale have not been reliably confirmed in public. I mention it for one reason. 500 years after his death, the most expensive object ever sold in the history of art may or may not be by him, and nobody can settle it. Even the attributions are unfinished. The man's entire estate, from the horse to the wall to the woman to the price record, is a set of open questions, and that is not a coincidence, and it is not bad luck. It is the shape a life takes when the person living it preferred questions. Chapter 22. The Battle That Ran Down the Wall. In 1503 or 1504, the Florentine government commissioned him to paint a battle on the wall of the Sala del Gran Consiglio, the great council chamber of the Palazzo Vecchio. The subject was the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine victory of 1440. Michelangelo, 23 years younger and already famous, was commissioned for the opposite wall with a different battle, the two of them in the same room at the same time. It is the most anticipated artistic contest that never happened. Neither man completed his wall. Leonardo made the cartoon, the full-scale preparatory drawing, and it was displayed, and young artists came to copy it, and they described the central group, a knot of horsemen fighting over a standard, as the most violent and alive thing anyone had drawn. Rubens made a copy of a copy a century later, and even at that remove, through two sets of other hands, it is terrifying. Then he began to put it on the wall. And he did not use fresco, because we know by now that he could not use fresco. Instead, he attempted a technique involving wax and heat, something like the encaustic of the ancient world, which he had read about and wanted to revive because it promised the richness and revisability of oil on a wall. He built braziers to drive the heat into the surface and set the medium. The lower part took, the upper part did not. The heat did not reach it properly, the medium stayed soft, and the paint began to run down the wall. He stopped. He was paid, in part, and there was an unpleasant business about repaying some of the advance. The wall was eventually covered over, and Vasari himself painted a different battle on top of it 50 years later, and there is an ongoing, contested, occasionally acrimonious search for whether anything of Leonardo survives underneath. Two great wall paintings, two invented techniques, two failures of material. At some point, a pattern stops being bad luck. He was the most technically curious painter who has ever lived, and he twice bet a monumental commission on an untested method and lost twice, and both times the reason he needed the untested method was that the tested method would not let him keep thinking. Chapter 23. A note on Michelangelo. Briefly, I am going to spend one chapter on the other man, because the contrast is instructive and because it will stop tonight from being sentimental. Michelangelo Buonarroti was born in 1475, 23 years after Leonardo. They disliked each other in the specific way that two extremely capable people who work in incompatible ways dislike each other. There are reports of a public exchange in Florence in which Michelangelo made a cutting remark about the Milan horse that never got made, which, if true, tells you that the horse was a known wound. Michelangelo finished things. Not everything. He left plenty unfinished, including some of his most powerful sculptures, the so-called prisoners, half emerged from the marble. He was chronically overcommitted and constantly furious about it, and the tomb of Julius II consumed 40 years of his life and came out much smaller than planned. But he finished the David. He finished the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, 4 years on scaffolding in physical misery, and delivered it. He finished the Pieta at 24. He carried enormous projects to a terminal state repeatedly across a working life of 70 years. And the difference, I think, is not talent, and it is not discipline in the moralizing sense. It is that Michelangelo believed the object was the point. The figure was in the stone, and his job was to take away what was not the figure. That is a task with an end. You can know when you are done, because the figure is out. Leonardo believed the understanding was the point, and the object was a place where understanding got tested. That is a task with no end. Both are legitimate. Both produced immortal work. But only one of them can ever be finished. And if you are the other kind, no amount of self-discipline will convert you. And I suspect some of you have spent 30 years trying and calling the failure a character flaw. It is not a character flaw. It is a different relationship to endings. We will come back to what to do about it in Hour 4. Chapter 24. Rome and the Humiliation. From about 1513 to 1516, he was in Rome, in the Vatican, under the patronage of Giuliano de' Medici, brother of Pope Leo X. He had rooms in the Belvedere. He was in his 60s. It should have been the summit. Rome under Leo was the richest artistic commission market in the world. The new St. Peter's was going up. Raphael was painting the papal apartments. Michelangelo was there. Leonardo got almost nothing. He worked on mirrors, on optics, on some engineering for the draining of the Pontine marshes, on mathematics, on a few small paintings. He was consulted. He was respected as a famous old man. He was not given the work. There is a line reported of Pope Leo, and it is second-hand and should be treated as such, to the effect that this man will never do anything, because he begins by thinking about the end before the beginning. Whether or not Leo said it, somebody in Rome was saying it, because it was the settled view. Leonardo da Vinci was the greatest talent in Italy, and you could not rely on him. That is what a reputation for not finishing does. And it does not arrive all at once. It accumulates quietly for 30 years, and then one day it is simply what everybody knows about you, and the commissions go elsewhere, and nobody explains why. There is a small, specific sorrow in the Roman years that I want to name. He was also, in this period, dealing with the mirror workshop and with assistants who were unreliable, and there are notes of irritation and of small betrayals. And he was old, in a city of young men who had learned what he taught from other people's copies of his work. There is one object from the Roman years, or from just around them, and it is the last painting he is generally agreed to have made, and it is worth a few minutes because of what it is like. The St. John the Baptist in the Louvre. Almost the whole panel is black. Out of the black, a figure emerges from the waist up, softly lit, turned toward you, with long curling hair and a faint smile, and one arm raised and one finger pointing up out of the frame. There is no landscape. There is no grotto, no rocks, no receding water, none of the geology he loved. He has removed everything. After a lifetime of putting the whole visible world into the background of every picture he made, the last one has no background at all, just the dark. A body coming out of it, and a hand indicating something outside the picture that you cannot see. People find it unsettling and many people dislike it, and I understand why. The smile is the Mona Lisa smile with nothing else to look at, and the finger points at something the painting refuses to supply. I think it is the most honest object he ever made. An old man, hand failing. At the end of a life spent trying to see how everything works, paints a figure in the dark, pointing away from itself at something not shown. He left Rome in 1516 when Giuliano de' Medici died, and accepted an invitation from the King of France. He was 64, and he had one journey left. Chapter 25. The man who wrote the verdict. Almost everything the world believes about Leonardo's character comes from one book written by one man who never met him. Giorgio Vasari was born in 1511. Leonardo died in 1519. Vasari was 8 years old. He was a working painter and architect himself, and in 1550 he published The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors and Architects, expanded in a second edition in 1568, and that book effectively invented art history as a discipline in Europe. It is indispensable. It is also, in places, gossip written down with confidence. Vasari's Leonardo is a portrait of dazzling gifts undermined by inconstancy. He praises the man extravagantly and then delivers the judgment that has followed him for 5 centuries. That Leonardo's mind was so restless and his conception so grand that he began many things and completed almost none of them, that he would have been capable of anything if his desires had held still. That sentence created the Leonardo of popular memory. Not the notebooks, which nobody could read. Not the paintings, most of which were in private hands. A paragraph of moral criticism written by a working painter of the next generation on the basis of what people in Florence said about the old man. And here is why I am spending a chapter on it. Vasari also tells the story of Leonardo dying in the arms of the King of France, with Francis holding his head as he went. It is one of the most reproduced scenes in the history of art. Painters painted it for 300 years. It is almost certainly not true. The documentary record places Francis I elsewhere on the 2nd of May 1519, issuing business at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, several days' travel away. So the same source that gave us the verdict on his character also gave us a deathbed that did not happen. I am not telling you to throw Vasari out. Much of what he reports is corroborated, and the general picture of a man who left work unfinished is confirmed by the objects themselves, which is a much better witness than any biographer. The Adoration really is bare. The horse really was. Never cast, but I want you to notice the machinery, because you have this machinery running in your own head at 1 a.m. A summary judgment about a person's whole life, delivered in one sentence by a source who was not there, based on what was generally said, and repeated so often that it became the truth. You do that to yourself. The 1 a.m. voice is Vasari, confident, fluent, second-hand, and unexamined. And there is one more thing we do not securely know, which I have been saving for exactly this point. because it is the perfect illustration of how thin the record is under all that confidence. We are not certain what he looked like. There is an image everybody uses, a red chalk drawing of an old man's head in three-quarter profile, long hair, long beard, heavy brow, an expression of tremendous weary authority. It is in the Biblioteca Reale in Turin. It is on the covers of the books and in the encyclopedias, and, I would guess, on most of the thumbnails you have ever seen attached to his name. It is traditionally called his self-portrait. Both halves of that are disputed. Whether the sitter is Leonardo is questioned by many specialists. Whether the drawing is even by Leonardo has been questioned too. The tradition that it is a self-portrait is not contemporary. It accumulated later because people wanted a face, and this was the best available candidate, and once an image is used often enough, the question stops being asked. There is a more securely evidenced likeness, a profile drawing at Windsor generally attributed to Melzi, of an older man with a straight nose and long hair, which is the portrait made by the person who actually looked at him every day for 12 years. So the situation is this. The most recognizable face in the history of ideas may not be his face. The one that probably is his is barely reproduced. I find that appropriate, and I hope you do too. We have spent an hour discussing what Leonardo was really like on the basis of a biographer who was 8, a psychoanalyst working from a mistranslated bird, and a portrait that may be of somebody else entirely. Which should give you a certain useful humility about the confidence of the voice in your own head at this hour, describing your own life to you in a tone that brooks no argument, working from sources it has never once checked. Chapter 26. Freud opens the file. In 1910, Sigmund Freud published a short book about Leonardo da Vinci. It is the strangest thing in his bibliography, and it is essential to tonight, because it is the first serious attempt anyone made to ask the question I asked you at the beginning. Not what did he fail to finish, but what was happening in him that made finishing so hard. Freud was 54. Psychoanalysis was about 15 years old. And he chose as his subject a man dead for 4 centuries, on the basis of the surviving documents, which is a method with obvious and severe problems, as Freud himself half acknowledged. His starting point was a single passage in the notebooks. Leonardo, writing about the flight of the kite, a bird of prey common in Tuscany, breaks off and records what he describes as his earliest memory, that it seemed to him he was destined to write about the kite, because in his first memory, while he was in his cradle, a kite came to him and opened his mouth with its tail, and struck him with its tail many times between his lips. That is what the note says. It is an extraordinary thing for anyone to write down, and it is genuinely there in his hand. Freud built his entire book on it, and to do so, he read it in a German translation which rendered the Italian nibbio, kite, as Gaia, vulture. That single substitution is the hinge, because Freud then went to Egyptian religion where the vulture is associated with the mother goddess, and where a tradition held that vultures were all female and conceived without a male, and he constructed an argument that the memory encoded an unconscious fantasy about a childhood with a mother and no father. The bird in the note is not a vulture, it is a kite. The Egyptian material does not apply. The art historian Eric McLagan pointed the error out publicly in the 1920s, and the criticism has never gone away. And later scholars, including Maya Shapiro in the 1950s, took the rest of the structure apart fairly comprehensively. So the most famous psychological study of Leonardo da Vinci rests in its central mechanism on a mistranslated bird. Keep that. It is going to be funny in about 10 minutes, and then it is going to be useful. Chapter 27. What Freud got wrong. Plainly. Let me clear the ground honestly, because I will not use Freud as an authority after I have shown you the hole in him. The vulture is wrong. The Egyptian mother goddess reading collapses with it. The reading of the Mona Lisa smile as a recovered memory of his mother's smile is unsupported speculation. It is beautiful writing, and it is not evidence. Freud was working partly from Walter Pater and the 19th century aesthetic tradition, which had already made the smile into a symbol of something unknowable, and he psychologized a literary idea. The claim that Leonardo's sexuality can be diagnosed at 4 centuries distance from documentary fragments is not something a careful person should assert. What the record contains is this. In 1476 in Florence, an anonymous accusation of sodomy was lodged, naming Leonardo among several young men. The case was dismissed for want of corroboration. He never married, had no children, and lived his adult life surrounded by male students and companions, one of whom, Salai, he took in at 10 and kept close for 25 years, and another of whom, Melzi, he made his heir. Beyond that we are guessing, and Freud guessed with the confidence of a man who thought he had a method. And the general problem, which applies to the whole genre, you cannot analyze a person who cannot answer you. Analysis depends on the patient's response, on resistance, on correction. A dead man agrees with everything. Modern readers generally treat the Leonardo book as a document about Freud. That is fair. And yet, Chapter 28. What Freud got right, and why it will not go away. Strip out the bird, strip out Egypt, strip out the smile. What remains is one idea, and it has survived a century of demolition, and I think it is the best single sentence anyone has written about the psychology of not finishing. Freud's claim was this. In Leonardo, the drive to investigate did not sit alongside the drive to make. It replaced it. The desire to know consumed the desire to complete, and consumed it from the inside, so that the researcher in him never left the artist free. Say that again slowly. The researcher did not leave the artist free. That is not a moral failing. It is not weak will. It is a competition between two appetites inside one person, in which the appetite to understand is stronger and more easily satisfied than the appetite to deliver, and every hour spent understanding feels like work because it is work, and at the end of a decade of it, there is nothing on the wall. Freud thought the investigative drive in Leonardo was so powerful because it had absorbed energy that would otherwise have gone elsewhere, into desire, into ordinary attachment, into a life. He called that sublimation. You do not have to accept the drive theory to see the phenomenon. Anyone who has watched a person pour the whole force of an unspent life into a subject has seen it. And then Freud wrote a sentence about Leonardo that I think about more than anything else in the book. He described him as being like a man who woke too early in the darkness while everyone else was still asleep. That is the line. Not because it flatters him, because of what it says about the condition. To be awake before there is anything to see. To have the equipment for a world that does not exist yet, and no colleagues, and no method, and no journal to publish in, and no way to check whether you are right, he was not slow. He was early, and being early is a form of solitude that looks exactly like failure from the inside. Hold that alongside what I said about flight. He understood the fluid dynamics and could not build the aircraft, because the materials and the power source would not exist for 400 years. The gap was not in him. Some of what is on your list is not on it because you failed. Some of it is on it because you were early, or undersupplied, or working alone on something that needs 3 people. And there is no more moral content in that than there is in the absence of an internal combustion engine in 1505. I want you to sleep with that thought if you can. Not all of it was you. Chapter 29. The House of the Unfinished, which is larger than you think. Before we go into the laboratory, one short chapter of company, because it will help you to know how populated this house is. Franz Kafka published almost nothing in his lifetime, and instructed his friend Max Brod to burn everything. The Trial, The Castle, America, all unfinished, all published because Brod ignored him. The 3 novels which define the 20th century's sense of bureaucratic dread do not have endings. Robert Musil wrote The Man Without Qualities for over 20 years, and died in 1942 with it unfinished, having revised the same middle section repeatedly. Antoni Gaudí began the Sagrada Familia in 1882, said openly that his client was not in a hurry, and was killed by a tram in 1926 with the building a fraction complete. It is still not complete. It is one of the most visited buildings on Earth. Charles Darwin sat on the theory of natural selection for around 20 years, writing, gathering, delaying, and published in 1859, largely because Alfred Russel Wallace forced the issue by arriving at the same idea and writing to him about it. Schubert's 8th Symphony, 2 movements, abandoned in 1822, played constantly. Michelangelo's Prisoners, half out of the marble, are for many people more affecting than the finished figures. And Chaucer and Spencer and Coleridge and Mozart's Requiem and Dickens dying mid-sentence in a mystery nobody can solve. I am not saying unfinished is good. Kafka wanted his burned. Musil was in despair. These are not victories. I am saying that if the unfinished were really the disqualifying flaw that the One in the Morning voice says it is, then the shelf of things that have most shaped human thought would be nearly empty. It is not nearly empty. A large portion of it is made of fragments, and the fragments have done the work anyway, and their makers mostly died not knowing. And there is a second wing of that house which nobody talks about, and it is much bigger, and you are in it. Because the famous fragments are only the ones whose makers were already famous. Kafka's unfinished novels survive because Brod thought they mattered. Musil is on a shelf because he was Musil. Everything else is gone. Every abandoned manuscript by somebody who was not going to be famous. Every workshop that closed. Every invention worked out on the back of an envelope by a man who then had to go to work. Every song written once and never recorded. Every treatise on water by somebody with no Melzi. That is the overwhelming majority of human intellectual effort across all of history. And it has left no trace at all. And it was not less real while it was happening. I raise it because the one in the morning voice makes an assumption you have never checked. It assumes that the unfinished thing was, in the end, worth nothing because nothing came of it. But we have no idea what things are worth. That is the actual position. Leonardo did not know that the flight notebooks were the valuable part and the horse was not. Zeigarnik did not know that a graduate paper would outlast 50 years of clinical work. Melzi did not know he was doing the most important thing anyone would ever do with those pages. Nobody knows in the moment, and the accounting is done long after the accountant has left. So the confident valuation your mind is performing right now, at this hour, on your own unfinished work, is being carried out by an appraiser with no access to the market, no comparables, and a documented bias. You are in a very large house. Most of the rooms are occupied. Nobody in here is impressed by your list. Chapter 30. An interval in which nothing is required. We are about a third of the way through, and I want to give you a few minutes with nothing in them. If you are still awake, this is a good place to let the shoulders down. There is no argument in this chapter. Nothing follows from it. If you are drifting, drift. Consider the physical fact of a Tuscan hill town in the 15th century. The stone is warm in the afternoon. There are olives, which are silver, on one side of the leaf. Water runs in a channel beside the road because somebody cut the channel generations ago and nobody remembers who. A boy who has been told he cannot be a notary walks up the hill, and there is nothing else he is required to do this afternoon, and he watches how the water moves around a stone. That is all. He is not being a genius. He is a child, on a hill, watching water. Everything that happens for the next 65 years, the horse, the wall, the woman's face, the ox heart, the 13,000 pages, is that afternoon extended. He never stopped being a boy watching water. That is the whole of it, and it is the reason he could not finish anything, and it is the reason we are still talking about him 500 years later, and those are not two facts, they are one fact. Or consider the workshop in Florence in the morning 30 years later. It smells of linseed oil and of the glue they size the panels with, which is made from animal skin and is not pleasant. There is a boy grinding lapis with a stone muller, which takes hours, and turns the most expensive blue in Europe out of a rock, and he is bored, and his arm aches, and nobody has told him that this is a historic period. Outside, a cart. Someone is arguing about the price of eggs, because egg is what you bind tempera with, and the price of eggs is a professional concern. A dog is asleep in the doorway in a patch of sun, and will not move for anybody. And there is a man of 50 in the corner who is supposed to be working on a portrait of a merchant's wife, and who has instead spent the morning trying to understand why, when he half closes his eyes, the edge of her cheek stops being a line. Nobody in that room is aware that anything is happening. It is a Tuesday. The eggs are expensive. The dog is asleep. That is what the making of the most famous object in the world was actually like, from inside, on the day. It was not momentous, it never is. The day you are inside is never the day that turns out to have mattered, and that is not a tragedy, it is just the arrangement, and it means the ordinariness of your own Tuesday is not evidence of anything at all. Nothing is required of you either, not tonight. Whatever is on the list is on the list, and it will still be on the list in the morning, and the morning is the correct place to look at it. This hour is not the correct place. This hour has no judgment in it, only the illusion of judgment, which is a trick of tiredness. And if you want somewhere else to rest for a while, here is the room the notebooks were kept in for 50 years, after he died, before anything went wrong. A villa in Lombardy, at Vaprio d'Adda, above the river Adda, Melzi's family house. Thick walls, cool in summer. There is a room with the boxes in it, and a table, and a window. A man in his 40s comes in most days when he can. He is a competent painter with a comfortable income and no urgent need to be anywhere. He takes out a sheet at random because there is no other way to take them out, and he turns it around until he can read it, and he reads it in a mirror or by holding it up to the light from the back, and he copies out what it says in ordinary left-to-right handwriting into a fair copy, and he puts the sheet into a pile according to what it is about. Painting, water, shadow, the horse, anatomy. He does that for years. There is no deadline. Nobody is paying him. Nobody is waiting for the book. Because nobody knows the book is possible. His friends probably think it is a strange way for a gentleman to spend his afternoons. Outside the window the adder goes past, doing the thing the man whose handwriting he is reading spent 60 years watching it do. There is nothing anxious in that room. That is what I want you to have for a moment. Not achievement, not urgency, not the horse or the wall or the deluge. Just a quiet man at a table with a large amount of unfinished work in front of him, going through it slowly, without distress, because it is worth going through and there is time. That is available to you tomorrow, incidentally. Not tonight. Tonight is not for going through anything. Breathe out. The olives are silver on one side. When you are ready, we are going to Berlin, to a laboratory in the 1920s where a young woman is about to work out exactly why your list exists. Chapter 31. The waiter who could not remember a paid bill. Berlin. the 1920s. The Psychological Institute of the University of Berlin, which at that moment was one of the 2 or 3 most interesting rooms in the world. Kurt Lewin taught there. He was in his 30s, a German Jewish psychologist who had come out of the First World War with an interest in how the world looks from inside a person rather than from outside, and he had gathered around him a group of graduate students, many of them women, many of them from Eastern Europe, at a time when neither of those things was easy. They did not meet only in the institute, they met in a cafe near it for hours arguing. That detail matters because of what happened in the cafe. Lewin noticed the waiter. The waiter could tell you, without notes, exactly what every table had ordered and what each of them owed. He carried the whole room in his head. But once a table had paid, the waiter could not reconstruct what they had eaten. It was gone, not fading, gone, immediately, as though a file had been closed. Most people would find that unremarkable. Lewin found in it the shape of a theory. His idea, and it is the core of what he called field theory, was that when a person takes on an intention, something forms inside them that behaves like a tension, not a memory exactly. A charged state, a system under pressure which is oriented toward its own discharge. He used the word Spannung, tension, and he spoke of quasi-needs, intentions that have taken on the character of needs. While the tension exists, the material connected to it stays accessible, stays lit, stays near the surface. It has to, because it is still needed. When the intention is fulfilled, the tension discharges and the material goes dark. The waiter's memory was not a memory system. It was a set of open tensions, each one belonging to a table, each one dissolving the instant the money changed hands. Now, put your hand on this, because we have just arrived at your list. Everything on that list is an open tension, not a memory of a failure, a live, charged, unresolved state sitting inside you, held open because you once formed the intention and never closed it. That is why it does not feel like the past. It feels like the present, at 1 a.m, with a slight urgency. It is not nostalgia, and it is not guilt, whatever the voice calls it. It is an open loop, doing exactly what an open loop is built to do, which is to stay available. The system is working correctly. That is the difficult part. Chapter 32. Bluma Zeigarnik, 1927. One of the students in that group was a young woman named Bluma Zeigarnik. She was born in 1899 or 1901, depending on the source, in Prienai, in what is now Lithuania. She had come to Berlin to study. Lewin gave her the waiter problem to test. Her design was simple, which is why it is famous. She gave participants a series of small tasks, modeling something from clay, simple arithmetic, puzzles, naming things. Ordinary, undemanding, about 20 of them. She let them complete some of the tasks. The others she interrupted. Partway through, she would stop them and move them on to the next thing, with some plausible reason or no reason. Then, later, without warning, she asked them to list the tasks they had done. The interrupted ones came back far better. The commonly cited result is that participants recalled the unfinished tasks roughly twice as often as the finished ones. The finished tasks had gone the way of the paid bill. She published it in 1927 in Psychologische Forschung, and the phenomenon has carried her name ever since. The Zeigarnik effect. What she demonstrated is not that we remember failures. It is much more specific and much stranger than that. She demonstrated that completion is what makes a thing forgettable. Sit with the direction of that arrow, because it is the reverse of how it feels. You are not lying awake, because those things went badly. Plenty of things went badly, and you cannot remember them. You are lying awake, because those particular things never got closed. And an unclosed thing is, by the design of the machinery, more available to you than a closed one. The 9 projects you completed in 1998 are gone completely. They discharged. The one you stopped at 60% is at the front of the queue, tonight at 1 in the morning, 500 years old and fresh as paint. Which means the contents of that list are not a fair sample of your life. They are a biased sample, selected by a mechanism for exactly one property. Not importance, not value, not how much you failed, only openness. The list is not an inventory of who you are. It is a printout of what is still switched on. Before we leave her, I want to tell you what happened to Bluma Zeigarnik, because she is usually reduced to an effect, and she was a person, and her life is one of the quiet stories of the century. She did not stay in Berlin. In the early 1930s, she returned to the Soviet Union, which was, in retrospect, the more dangerous of the 2 available choices, and she arrived into Moscow psychology at the moment when Moscow psychology was the most exciting and the most perilous place in the field. She worked with Lev Vygotsky, who died young in 1934 and who is now recognized as one of the 2 or 3 most important developmental psychologists who ever lived. She worked alongside Alexander Luria, the founder of modern neuropsychology. Between them, that laboratory was doing work that the West would spend the next 50 years catching up with, in conditions of political danger that are difficult to overstate. Biographical accounts record that her husband was arrested at the end of the 1930s and that she did not see him again for many years, and that she raised her children and continued to work. And what she built out of that was the discipline of Soviet experimental pathopsychology, the systematic experimental study of how thinking is altered by illness and injury. She spent her career, decades of it, in clinics, with patients whose reasoning had been changed by schizophrenia or brain damage, working out what was actually happening in there. In 1983, near the end of her life, she was given the Kurt Lewin Memorial Award, named for the teacher who had handed her the waiter problem in a Berlin cafe 56 years earlier. She died in 1988. I tell you this partly because she deserves it, and partly for one reason connected to tonight. The most famous thing about her is a paper she wrote as a graduate student in her 20s about interrupted tasks, and it has her name on it forever. The work of her actual life, the 50 years in the clinics, is known to specialists and to almost nobody else. She had no more control over which part of her lasted than Leonardo did. You do not get to choose which part of your work survives you. Neither did he, neither did she. That is not a reason to stop working, and it is a very good reason to stop grading yourself on a scoreboard whose rules are not published and whose results arrive after you are gone. Chapter 33. Ovsiankina and the pull back toward the thing. There was another woman in that laboratory, and she found the other half, and she is much less famous than she should be. Maria Ovsiankina, born in 1898, also working under Lewin, published in 1928. Zeigarnik had shown that interrupted tasks are remembered. Ovsiankina asked a different question. What do people do about it? Her participants were also interrupted mid-task. Then they were left in a room with the interrupted task still available and no instruction to return to it. No reward, no requirement. Often the task was trivial, a shape to be assembled, a pattern to be laid out. Nobody was watching in any way they were told about. They went back to it. Spontaneously, in large numbers, they returned to the unfinished thing and completed it, for nothing, because it was open. That is the Ovsiankina effect, and it is one of the most quietly profound findings in psychology because of what it says about the direction of the force. The open loop does not merely stay in memory, it exerts a pull. It wants to be closed, and it will use you to close it without your permission and without any external motive. And here is the important thing, the thing that will help you tonight. That pull is not a punishment. It is not your conscience. It is the same force that gets a novel finished, that gets a shed roof mended, that gets a person to pick the guitar back up in their 60s. It is the engine. It is the reason anything ever gets done at all. You have simply got a lot of them running at once, and the machinery cannot prioritize. And at 1 a.m, the executive part of you that normally keeps them in order has gone off duty and left them all running in an empty building. Leonardo had, by any reckoning, hundreds of these open at once. The treatise on water, the anatomy, the horse, dead but never closed. The Mona Lisa, in the house, unresolved, for 16 years, physically present, an open loop you could look at, flight, optics, the Arno, the Tiburio. He walked around inside a building where every alarm was going off, all the time, gently, for 40 years. And he wrote near the end in mirror writing, "Tell me if anything was ever done." That is not a man reviewing his achievements. That is a man standing in the middle of the noise. Chapter 34. The honest caveat, and the one thing that actually works. I am going to be straight with you about the state of the evidence, because I would rather you trusted me than felt better for 10 minutes. The Zeigarnik effect, as a simple universal law, has a mixed record. It has been replicated many times, and it has also failed to replicate. What the accumulated work suggests is that it is real but conditional. It depends on how much the person cared, on how difficult the task was, on whether they expected to be able to finish, on whether their self-regard was involved. An interrupted task you never cared about does not haunt anyone. So it is not a machine that grinds identically in everybody. It is a tendency strongest exactly where the stakes were personal. Which, incidentally, is why your list is made of the things it is made of, not the trivial abandoned tasks, the ones where you were in it. Now the useful part. In 2011, E.J. Masicampo and Roy Baumeister published a set of experiments in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology with a title I have always admired: Consider It Done. They took unfulfilled goals, the kind that intrude on your thinking, and they tested what would reduce the intrusion. Completing the task obviously works, but that is not usually available. What they found is that it was not necessary. Making a specific plan for the goal was enough. Not achieving it, not starting it. Writing down concretely when and where and how the thing would be done. Participants who did that showed reduced intrusive thoughts about the unfinished goal and performed better on unrelated tasks afterwards, as though the resource the open loop had been consuming was released. The tension system, it appears, will accept a credible plan as a form of closure. It is not asking you to have finished. It is asking to be told that it is handled. I am telling you this at chapter 34 of 48 at some hour of the night, because I want it to be there in the morning and not now. Do not get up and make plans. That is the opposite of what tonight is for. But note it in the way you note a light left on in another room, tomorrow or someday, on paper, in daylight. The list can be answered, not completed. Answered. Each item gets one of three things: a specific next action with a time, a decision to formally let it go, or a statement that it belongs to the second kind of work, the kind with no terminal state and was never going to finish and is therefore not a debt. That is all the machinery wants. It is a filing system that has been left holding papers because nobody ever told it where they go. Chapter 35. Why he thought he could cast it. Let me use one more piece of modern work to explain the horse. In 1979, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky described what they called the planning fallacy. The tendency to underestimate the time, cost, and risk of a future action while overestimating its benefits, not occasionally, systematically in a direction by people who are experts in the domain. In 1994, Roger Buehler, Dale Griffin, and Michael Ross ran the study that makes it concrete. They asked students to predict when they would finish their theses. They asked for a realistic estimate and then separately for a worst case. Roughly a third of students finished by their own realistic estimate. Fewer than half finished by the date they had described as their worst possible case. The classic public example is the Sydney Opera House, estimated at $7 million Australian dollars and due in 1963, completed in 1973 for $102 million. The mechanism, as Kahneman later described it, is that we plan from the inside. We construct a scenario of the project going as intended, step by step, and we do not add the unspecified interference that has attended every comparable project in history, because interference is by nature unspecific and you cannot picture it. The corrective is to look outside, at the base rate. How long did the last 20 projects like this actually take? Now, 1493. A clay horse the size of a house is standing in Milan and the bronze has not arrived. From the inside, the plan was sound. The engineering worked on paper. Leonardo had solved genuinely hard problems about the poor. The remaining steps were known operations. There was no reason, from inside the plan, that it should not be cast within a year. From the outside, the base rate was this. Italian city-states in the 1490s were unstable. French armies were a live possibility. Ducal finances were committed elsewhere, and bronze is what cannon are made of. He did not fail to be a good engineer. He failed to be a pessimist about history, which is a much more common and much more forgivable failure, and one that almost every person listening has committed about their own list. Every item on it was scheduled by a version of you who planned from the inside and did not know about the illness, the redundancy, the divorce, the parent who needed care, the 2 years that simply went. The plan was not stupid. The plan was made without the war in it. Nobody's plan has the war in it. Chapter 36. The difference between wanting it good and fearing it bad. There is one more piece of laboratory work I want, and it is the one that separates two things almost everyone runs together. In 1990, Randy Frost and colleagues published a multidimensional scale of perfectionism. In 1991, Paul Hewitt and Gordon Flett published another distinguishing perfectionism directed at yourself, at others, and perfectionism you believe is demanded of you by others. What emerged from that work, and from the meta-analytic reviews that followed, is that perfectionism is not one thing, it is at least two, and they behave completely differently. The first is usually called perfectionistic strivings, high personal standards, wanting the work to be excellent, caring about the quality of the join, the sentence, the shading. On its own, this is broadly neutral or even positive. It is associated with conscientiousness and with achievement. It does not by itself make you miserable, and it does not by itself stop you finishing. The second is usually called perfectionistic concerns. Concern over mistakes, doubts about your own actions, the sense that others require flawlessness of you. This is the toxic component. It is the one associated with depression, anxiety, avoidance, and with not shipping. The distinction is the whole ballgame, because the two feel identical from inside and are treated as one thing by the one in the morning voice. Wanting the painting to be extraordinary is why the Mona Lisa has 30 layers of glaze. Being unable to bear the moment at which the painting stops being improvable and becomes a thing that can be judged is why it never left the house. Same man. Same afternoon, probably. Entirely different mechanisms. And one more correction, because a great deal of nonsense is said about this. It is widely assumed that perfectionism is the main cause of procrastination. In 2007, Piers Steele published a large meta-analysis of the procrastination literature in Psychological Bulletin, and perfectionism was a much weaker predictor than the folklore claims. The heavy hitters were task aversiveness, impulsiveness, low expectancy of success, and the delay between the effort and the reward. Look at that list against Leonardo. Task aversiveness for the mechanical months of laying colour into a finished design, high. Impulsiveness in the sense of being captured by whatever is in front of you, extremely high and documented on every page where a shopping list sits next to a heart valve. Delay between effort and reward, in the case of a treatise on water with no publisher and no readers, effectively infinite. He was not destroyed by wanting it too good. He was pulled apart by a reward that never arrived, and a next question that always did. Chapter 37. The sleep schedule he did not have. You may have encountered at some point on the internet the Da Vinci sleep schedule. 20 minutes of sleep every 4 hours, 6 naps in the 24, 2 hours of sleep in total, and thereby a man who had time to be Leonardo. There is no primary source basis for it. None. There is no note in the notebooks describing such a regime, no contemporary account of it, no letter, nothing in Vasari. The schedule is a 20th and 21st century invention from the world of extreme polyphasic sleep advocacy, and his name was attached to it because attaching his name to a productivity claim is the oldest trick in the genre. I am glad to be able to tell you this at 2 a.m. You are not failing to be a genius because you sleep in one piece, but there is something real in the neighborhood, and it is much kinder. The historian Roger Ekirch, in a body of work published around 2005, assembled a very large amount of pre-industrial evidence from diaries, court records, medical texts, literature, and prayers, showing that in Europe, before artificial lighting, the normal pattern of a night was not 1 block of sleep, it was 2. People went to bed not long after dark. They slept for 3 or 4 hours. This was called, in English sources, the first sleep. Then they woke for an hour or more in the middle of the night, and this waking was entirely ordinary and expected. They lay in the dark. They talked quietly. They prayed. They thought about what had happened that day. There were manuals with prayers written specifically for that interval. And then they went back down into what they called the second sleep until morning. The waking was not a symptom. It was a room in the house of the night, and it had furniture in it. You may be in that room right now. If you are, I would like you to consider the possibility that you are not malfunctioning, that the hour you have been treating as insomnia may be the interval, arriving as it has arrived for most of the human beings who have ever lived, and that the only genuinely modern thing about your version of it is that you have been told it is a problem and that you should be asleep, and that lying awake means something is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. You are in the interval, and the interval has always been full of people thinking about the things they have not done. That is not new either. What is new is the belief that you should be able to switch it off. Leonardo himself, somewhere in the notebooks, wrote a line about sleep, and it survives among his collected sayings, and it goes roughly like this. As a day well spent brings a sweet sleep, so a life well used brings a sweet death, which is either a comfort or the most challenging sentence in this entire video, depending on the hour. Tonight, let it be the first one. Chapter 38. The productivity industry gets hold of him. There is a second distortion I want to take apart, and it is the mirror image of Vasari's. Vasari said the unfinished work proved a flaw. The modern version says the unfinished work proved a virtue. Leonardo was a great procrastinator. Therefore, procrastination is creative. Therefore, leave your things unfinished, and you too may be a genius. That is not an argument. That is a sentence shaped like an argument. Leonardo did not become extraordinary because he left things unfinished. He left things unfinished because of the same quality that made him extraordinary, which is not the same claim at all, and the difference is the whole difference between an explanation and a permission slip. And I want to be honest about the cost side of the ledger, because the productivity version always leaves it out. The monks of San Donato did not get their altarpiece. Isabella d'Este waited years for a painting that never came. The Florentine government paid an advance on a battle that ran down a wall and had to be argued about afterwards. Francesco del Giocondo, as far as we can tell, never got the portrait of his wife. And 300 years of physicians treated hearts on the basis of a wrong model, while the right one lay in a locked cabinet in a script nobody could read. Those are real costs, paid by real people who were not geniuses and who had simply commissioned some work. So no, it is not a virtue, it is not a flaw either. It is a temperament with an enormous upside and a real bill, and the bill was mostly paid by other people, and any account of him that leaves that out is flattering you rather than telling you something true. What I will say is this, and it is the useful version. The quality that leaves work unfinished and the quality that produces something nobody has thought of before are frequently the same quality. Not always. Plenty of unfinished work is unfinished because the person was frightened, or drinking, or exhausted, or in the wrong job. But often enough to matter, the reason a thing is not done is that the person kept looking after the point at which looking was required, and that surplus looking is where the new thing comes from. If that is you, the answer is not to become a different person. The answer, and we will get to it properly in 2 chapters, is a structural one, and Leonardo found it late and imperfectly, and it has a name, and the name is Francesco Melzi. Chapter 39. The temptation to diagnose him. I need to handle one more thing carefully, because it comes up whenever this subject does. In 2019, a paper appeared in the journal Brain by Marco Catani and Paolo Mazzarello, proposing that Leonardo's pattern of behavior, the constant switching, the abandoned projects, the mirror writing, the reported restlessness, was consistent with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It is a serious paper in a serious journal by serious people, and it is worth reading, and I am not going to sneer at it. I am also not going to endorse it. And here is why. You cannot diagnose a dead man. Diagnosis requires the person. It requires their account of their own experience, their developmental history from people who knew them, the exclusion of other explanations, and an assessment of impairment relative to their context. We have none of that for Leonardo. We have some objects, a great many pages, and a biographer who was 8 years old when he died. And there is a specific danger in retrospective diagnosis, which is that it explains a person by naming them. Once you have said the word, the thinking stops. You have not learned anything about why the horse was not cast. You have swapped one label, inconstant, for another label, disordered, and both of them close the file. What I think is defensible is this. The pattern is real. The switching is documented on the pages themselves. Whatever we would call that pattern today, and whether or not it would meet a threshold, the phenomenon is there, and it does not need a diagnostic code to be discussed. I raise it mainly because some of you have been quietly wondering about yourselves for some years whether there is a name for the thing you do. There may be. It may be worth finding out from someone qualified, in daylight, with your own history in the room. But do not do that work tonight, and do not do it from a 500-year-old man's notebooks. He is not evidence about you. He is company. Chapter 40. What actually makes things get finished? Let me put the useful findings together briefly, and then I am going to tell you the real answer, which is not a technique. The research on closing loops converges on a small number of unglamorous things. Specific intentions beat general ones. Peter Gollwitz's work on implementation intentions found that the form of the commitment matters enormously. Not "I will do the thing," but when situation X arises, I will do behavior Y. The if and the then, tying the action to a cue in the world rather than to your future willingness, because your future willingness is not a reliable supplier. Progress beats motivation. Teresa Amabile and Stephen Kramer, working from thousands of daily diary entries from people inside real organizations, found that the strongest single driver of good inner working life was the sense of having made progress in meaningful work. Not praise, not incentives, not clarity of vision. Progress in small units, visible. Constraint beats freedom. A deadline that is real, imposed by somebody else with a consequence, is worth more than any amount of internal resolve. This is not a moral point. It is the observation that fresco finishes and encaustic runs down the wall. Deciding not to do it is a completion. Formally abandoning a project closes the tension system, not vaguely dropping it, which leaves it open forever. Deciding and saying so out loud or on paper. Half of what is on your list wants to be closed by being released and has been waiting years for you to give it permission. And then the real answer, which is none of the above. Leonardo did finish things. Twice, clearly, in ways that lasted. He finished the polyhedra for Luca Pacioli's book on proportion, and they were printed and published in his lifetime, and they are perfect. and the treatise on painting exists and has been read by every serious painter in Europe for 400 years, and shaped the theory of art more than any other document of its period. He did not write it. He wrote the notes. Francesco Melzi assembled it. In both cases, the completion happened because there was another person whose job was the ending. That is the answer. It is not a productivity system. It is a person. Chapter 41. Francesco Melzi. Giovanni Francesco Melzi came from a noble Milanese family and joined Leonardo's household as a boy of about 14 or 15, around 1506 or 1507. He stayed for the rest of Leonardo's life. He went with him to Rome and over the Alps to France, and he was with him at the end, and Leonardo left him the notebooks, the drawings, the instruments, and effectively the whole intellectual estate. He was, by the surviving evidence, a competent painter and not a great one. He is not in the first rank, and he never would have been. He is one of the most important people in the history of European thought. Because after Leonardo died, Melzi took the chaos back to the family villa at Verrocchio d'Adda and spent decades on it. He read the mirror writing, he sorted the sheets, and out of a mass of notes written over 40 years, in no order, on both sides of the paper, at 90 degrees to each other, he compiled a coherent treatise on painting in a fair copy, arranged by subject, readable by another human being. That manuscript, and the copies made from it, is why the theory survived. Melzi wrote the book Leonardo did not write. He also, and this is the human part, seems to have simply loved him. The letter he wrote to Leonardo's brothers announcing the death describes the loss in a way that is not the language of a business associate. He calls him the best of fathers and says the grief is not possible for him to express. I want to make the point as plainly as I can because I think it is the most practically useful thing in these 4 hours. The greatest unfinished mind in history was completed by somebody else, not by becoming more disciplined, not by a system, by the presence, for the last 12 years of his life, of a devoted, organized, technically capable person of ordinary genius whose function was to close what he opened. If you are the kind of person whose work stays open, you do not need to become another kind of person. You have tried that for decades, and it has not worked, and it was never going to work. You need a Melzi, an editor, a partner, a colleague who likes finishing, a publisher with a contract, a collaborator whose satisfaction comes from the delivery rather than the question. Someone whose temperament is the complement of yours and who is not diminished by doing the part you cannot do. Almost nobody arranges this, because the culture tells us that finishing your own work is a test of character, and asking for the ending to be handled by another person feels like an admission. It is not an admission. It is the only thing that has ever worked, and we know it worked because you can go and read the book. I want to read you the shape of Melzi's letter because it is the last primary document of the story and because it tells you what the arrangement actually was. When Leonardo died, Melzi wrote to the half-brothers in Florence to inform them. It is a short letter, and it is not the language of an executor discharging a duty. He tells them that Leonardo was to him the best of fathers, and that it is not possible for him to express the grief he feels at the death, and that for as long as his limbs hold together he will feel perpetual unhappiness, and with reason, because Leonardo showed him every day the most passionate and burning affection. And he says that everyone is grieved at the loss of such a man, whose like nature no longer has it in her power to produce. Then he gets on with the estate. That is the Melzi arrangement, and I want to be precise about it, because it is easy to hear what I said in the last chapter as a recommendation to hire an assistant. It was not an employment, it was love with a filing system. The reason Melzi read 7,000 pages of mirror writing and spent decades assembling a treatise nobody had asked for is not that it was his job. It is that he had spent 12 years next to the man and thought the material mattered more than his own painting career, which it did, and he was right, and he gave up the second for the first. You cannot recruit that. It is not a role you advertise for. What you can do, and this is the honest and smaller version, is notice when someone like that is standing next to you and let them in. Tell them what the work is. Give them access to the mess rather than the tidied version. Most people with an open, unfinished mind hide the mess from precisely the people who would know what to do with it out of embarrassment and then die with it in boxes. Leonardo did not hide it. He handed over the whole chaotic estate in his will by name to a man of ordinary talent and extraordinary devotion. And that decision is the reason you have heard of any of the ideas in it. Of all the things he did or failed to do, that was the one that worked. And then it went wrong again, slowly, over centuries, and then it partly came right, and the story of what happened to those pages after Melzi died is the strangest ending in the history of documents. I want to tell it because it is the last thing in this video that is really about the nature of unfinished work. Melzi died around 1570. His heirs did not understand what was in the house. Sheets were given away to visitors as souvenirs, sold cheaply and taken. Then, at the end of the 16th century, Pompeo Leone acquired a great mass of them, and Leone did the thing I mentioned earlier. He took scissors to them. He believed the material would be more useful sorted, so he cut drawings out of pages and pasted them into albums by subject, separating a diagram from the note that explained it, cutting across the middle of arguments. He was not a vandal. He was trying to help. He was trying to finish the filing that Leonardo had left open, and he destroyed the connective tissue of the archive in the process, and it has never been fully reconstructed. The material then scattered across Europe for 300 years and travelled through some remarkable hands. One volume, mostly about water, passed through an Italian sculptor's collection, then to an English aristocrat, Thomas Coke, later the Earl of Leicester, who bought it in Italy around 1717 and took it to Norfolk, where it sat in a country house library and acquired the name Codex Leicester. It stayed in that family for over 2 centuries. It was sold in 1980 to the industrialist Armand Hammer, who renamed it after himself, which is the single most Armand Hammer act available. In 1994, it was sold again at auction for a little over $30 million to Bill Gates, who had it digitized and has lent it out to be exhibited around the world. That is one notebook's journey, Milan to a sculptor, to Norfolk, to Los Angeles, to Seattle, and then, in reproduction, to everybody. And then there is Madrid. In 1965, 2 volumes of Leonardo's notes were found in the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid, not found in an attic. They had been in the National Library of Spain the whole time, catalogued under the wrong number, so that anyone looking for Leonardo would not find them, and anyone finding them would not know what they were. They had been effectively lost for something like 2 centuries, sitting on a shelf in a public building in a European capital, 20 minutes from people who would have given their careers to read them. They are now called the Madrid Codices, and they contain, among other things, a large amount of the mechanical work and material relating to the casting of the horse. Consider what that means about the accounting. In 1964, the settled scholarly view of what Leonardo da Vinci had thought was one thing, in 1966 it was another, because of a filing error corrected 450 years after his death. The ledger is still open. It is open tonight. There may be more of it somewhere, miscatalogued in a building, and if there is, then the final assessment of the most examined mind in history has still not been made and cannot be made. Nothing about him is finished, including the question of what he did. Chapter 42. The 2 lists described for the morning. I said I would not make you do anything tonight, and I am not going to. This chapter is a description of something for later, delivered slowly, so that it is available to you when you are more used to yourself than you are now. At some point in daylight, with a sheet of paper, the list can be sorted, not completed, sorted. Everything on it goes into one of 2 columns. The first column is work with an ending, a thing that could be delivered, a room that could be painted, a letter that could be posted, a manuscript that could be sent to somebody who reads manuscripts. These items are real debts, and each one gets exactly one of 3 answers. A specific next action attached to a specific occasion, or a formal release in words on the page, "This is closed and I am not doing it," or a Melzi, a named person who will handle the ending. That is the whole first column. Action, release, or handover. No item is allowed to sit without one of the 3, because sitting without one of the 3 is what has been keeping it lit for 11 years. The second column is work with no ending, understanding something, getting better at something, being interested in something, your version of how water moves. Those items are not debts. They were never going to finish. There is no state of the world in which they are done, and therefore there is no failure in their not being done. And the guilt attached to them is a clerical error that has been accruing interest since roughly your late 20s. Write them down anyway, then write 1 sentence next to the column. This is not unfinished. This is ongoing. The reason to separate them is that the machinery cannot tell them apart. Lewin's tension system does not know the difference between an unposted letter and an unended curiosity. It holds both open with the same charge and hands them both to you at 1 in the morning with the same tone of voice. The sorting is something only the daylight version of you can do, and it takes about 40 minutes, and it is the single most restful piece of administration available to a human being. But not now. Now we are going to France, and to the last 3 years, and to a river, and to a very short sentence written in mirror writing that I have been keeping until the end. Chapter 43. Over the Alps with 3 paintings. In the winter of 1516, or early in 1517, at 64 years old, he crossed the Alps. Francis I of France, 22 years old, had met him in Italy and wanted him, not for a specific commission, for himself. The king gave him the title of first painter, engineer, and architect to the king, a pension, and the manor house of Clou, which is now called Clou-Lous, a small brick and stone house a few hundred yards from the royal chateau at Amboise on the Loire. Think about the journey. An old man, in winter, on mule tracks over a mountain range, with his household and his boxes. In the boxes were the notebooks. Thousands of sheets, 40 years of thinking, carried by hand over the Alps. And 3 paintings. We know which 3, because in October 1517 a cardinal came to visit, and his secretary, Antonio de Beatis, wrote down what he saw, a portrait of a certain Florentine lady made from life, a young Saint John the Baptist, and a Madonna and Child in the lap of Saint Anne. The Florentine lady is the Mona Lisa. 14 years after he began her, an old man carried her across a mountain range because he had not finished with her. De Beatis wrote something else, and it is the sentence that closes the working life. He recorded that Leonardo could no longer be expected to produce work of the old sweetness because of a paralysis affecting his hand. The account says the right hand, which has puzzled people ever since because he was left-handed, and scholars have argued about whether the secretary was confused or whether both were affected or whether the drawing hand still worked while the painting hand did not. The detail is uncertain. The fact is not. The hand was going. There was work in France, and it went the way the work always went, and I will tell you quickly because the pattern is now so familiar that it is almost restful. The king's mother, Louise of Savoy, wanted a palace. Leonardo was asked to design one at Romorantin on the river Soldra, and he did not design a palace, he designed a town. The drawings are there. A palace, yes, but around and through it an entire hydraulic scheme. Canals to bring water in, canals to take it away, a system for flushing the streets, locks, the river regulated, gardens irrigated. He surveyed the site himself at 65 with a bad hand in a foreign country, and he worked out the levels. It was begun. And then it was abandoned, and the reasons given in the sources include an outbreak of fever in the district, which in that low, wet country probably means malaria. The last great project of his life was cancelled by mosquitoes. There is also a mechanical lion. The records of French royal festivities in this period describe an automaton lion which walked forward and then opened its chest to reveal lilies, the flower of France, and the tradition attributes it to Leonardo. The attribution is not certain, and some of the accounts may describe more than one such device, made over several years. But something of that kind existed, and if it was his, then among the last things those failing hands built was a clockwork animal that walked a few paces and gave somebody flowers. I like that more than I can defend academically. He could still draw, and we know that because of what he drew next. Chapter 44. The Deluge. In the last 2 years of his life, in that house by the Loire, he made a series of drawings in black chalk that are now at Windsor, and they are like nothing else in the history of art before the 20th century. They are called the Deluge drawings. They show the end of a world. Enormous coiling masses of water and cloud descending on a landscape, mountains dissolving, trees going over. In some of them there are tiny human figures and horses being carried, and in others there is nothing human at all, only the vortices. The same vortices he had been drawing in streams and around bridge piers for 40 years, now the size of the sky. They are not illustrations of the biblical flood. There is no ark, no covenant, no God visible. They are studies of a force, done by a man who had spent his life learning how force moves through fluid, applied at last to the whole world at once. And here is what I want to say about them, gently, because it is nearly 3 in the morning. He did not stop. 66 years old, hand failing, in a foreign country, with no commission, with the horse gone, and the wall dying, and the treatise unwritten, and the book on anatomy dead with its author, he sat down and drew the biggest thing he could think of in chalk. For nobody. Not for a patron, not for a wall, not for a contract or a reputation or a delivery date. Nobody asked for the Deluge drawings. Nobody paid for them. There was no possibility of their being finished into anything, and no audience, and he was too ill to work them up even if there had been. He drew them because the water was still interesting. That is the answer to Vasari, and it took 500 years to arrive. The charge was that his desires would not hold still, that he lacked constancy. And here, at the very end, with every external reason removed, with nothing left to gain and nothing to prove, and no incentive of any kind, the thing he did was carry on looking at how water moves. That is not inconstancy. That is the most constant life I know of. He was interested in the same thing, without interruption, from a hillside in Vinci in about 1460 to a room in Amboise in 1518. 60 years on one subject. Almost nobody manages 60 years on one subject. He never finished a thing because he never left the thing. Chapter 45. The 23rd of April. On the 23rd of April, 1519, he made his will before a notary named Guillaume Borot at Amboise. He was 67, and he knew. It is a careful, orderly, entirely lucid document, and it is worth listening to what a man who finished nothing does when he finally has one thing that has to be completed properly. He arranged for his burial at the church of Saint Florentine in Amboise. He specified the masses to be said, the number of candles, the priests. He left money for the poor of the town. To Salai, who had come to him at 10 years old, been difficult for 25 years, and who he had once described in a note as a thief and a liar and a glutton, and had kept anyway, he left half of a vineyard outside Milan. To Battista de Villanis, his servant in France, the other half. To Maturina, his maidservant, a cloak of good black cloth, and a length of cloth, and 2 ducats. To his half-brothers in Florence, with whom he had had a long and bitter dispute about their father's inheritance, he left money that was owed to him and held in Florence. He settled it. He did not have to. And to Francesco Melzi, gentleman of Milan, he left the rest, everything, the books, all and each of them, the instruments and portraits pertaining to his art, the drawings, the notebooks, and the office of executor, because he was the one person who could be trusted with an ending. He died 9 days later, on the 2nd of May, 1519. The church of St. Florentine was pulled down in the early 1800s, and his grave was lost. Bones believed to be his were gathered decades later and reinterred in the chapel of Saint-Hubert up at the chateau, where visitors go now, and stand in front of a stone with his name on it that may or may not be over him. Even that is unfinished. Even the grave is a probably. Chapter 46. Tell me if anything was ever done. Now the sentence. Among the thousands of pages in his mirror hand, there is a short line in Italian that recurs. Dimmi se mai fu fatta cosa alcuna. Tell me if ever anything was done. It is the most quoted private sentence in his archive, and it is quoted because of what it appears to be, an old man, at the end asking the page whether any of it amounted to anything. I have to be honest with you about it, and the honesty makes it better rather than worse. Its status is not certain. The phrase appears more than once in the manuscripts, and among the pages where it appears, there are also pen exercises, repeated phrases, lines written to test a nib or to fill a space. Some scholars read it as a cry of despair. Others read it as a formula he happened to repeat. We do not know which, and anyone who tells you flatly that it was his dying lament is going further than the evidence goes. So take it as this instead, which is certain, because the words are in his hand, whatever the reason. Somewhere in the last years of the most productive mind in European history, that combination of words was in circulation in him, often enough to reach the paper more than once. Tell me if anything was ever done. And I would like to answer him, if you will allow it, because it is late and he is not here, and somebody should. The heart is a muscle with 4 chambers, and its valve is closed by a swirl of blood. The shells in the Tuscan hills are the remains of a sea, and the land is older than the story. Air is a fluid and a shaped surface. Moving through it will lift a weight. A river cuts here and lays down there, and the two are one process. Light does not stop at the edge of a thing. The spine has curves. A smile is a set of muscles, and if you soften the corners, the face will never resolve, and the person looking will not be able to leave. That was done. All of that was done by you, in the dark, in your own hand, for nothing. And every one of those sentences is true. And you were the first. And also, no, The horse was not cast, and the treatise was not written, and the wall is dying, and the man never got the portrait of his wife. Both answers are the true answer. He would have wanted both. He was not a man who liked a tidy result. Chapter 47. What the unfinished life actually did. I promised at the beginning that I would not tell you the unfinished work was secretly complete, and I am not going to. Let me say instead what I think is actually true, and then we will stop. A finished thing is a closed answer. It is delivered, it is judged, it takes its place, and it stops moving. That is a good thing, and the world needs them. And most of what holds your life up was finished by somebody. An unfinished thing is different. An unfinished thing is still a question, and a question keeps recruiting people. The Adoration of the Magi is in the Uffizi, with the underdrawing showing, and every painter who has stood in front of it for 400 years has been able to see how a picture gets thought, because the paint never went over the thinking. A finished Adoration would have taught nobody anything. There are 10,000 finished altarpieces. The Last Supper is a ruin, and the ruin is why every generation has had to go and look at it again, and argue about it, and restore it, and defend it from bombs and stables and doors cut in the wall. It has been kept alive by needing to be kept alive. The horse was never cast, and so the horse is still, 500 years later, the largest bronze that never existed. And people have built versions of it in Milan and in Michigan out of a desire to close a loop that Leonardo left open in 1499. And the notebooks, unpublished, unfinished, cut up by Pompeo Leone and scattered across 7 cities, have generated more scholarship, more searching, more careful attention from more intelligent people over more centuries than any tidy published treatise of his period. The treatise would have been superseded by 1580. The notebooks are still being read this year. I am not saying he was right to leave them. I am saying that an open loop does something a closed one cannot, which is that it stays warm and things gather around it. Now bring that home, because it is nearly the end, and this is the part that is about you. The things you did not finish are not only debts. Some of them are the places where you were still looking. And the reason they hurt at 1 a.m. is not that they are evidence against you. It is that they are still switched on, and a thing that is still switched on is by definition not dead. The list is not a record of your failures. It is a map of where you were most alive. That does not discharge the ones that are real debts, and tomorrow in daylight you can sort them, and some will need a next action, and some will need releasing, and some will need a Melzi. That is real work, and it is worth doing. But not one item on that list proves what the voice at 1 a.m. says it proves. The voice is Vasari. Confident, fluent, second-hand, and 8 years old. And there is one last thing, which is the quietest, and I think the truest, and then we will stop entirely. He wrote a line in the notebooks, and this one is not disputed. While I thought I was learning to live, he wrote, I was only learning to die. Most people read that as despair. I do not think it is. Read it again with the emphasis moved. He is not saying the life was wasted. He is saying that the thing he thought he was doing and the thing he was actually doing were different, and that he only found out late. He thought he was learning to live, which for him meant learning how everything works, so that eventually he would know enough to do it properly. The horse would be cast, the treatise would be written, the anatomy would be published, and then he would have arrived, and the arriving was the point. What he was actually doing was the looking. That was the whole thing. There was never going to be an arrival. The looking was not the preparation for the life, it was the life. And he could not see that until the hand stopped working and the arrival was obviously not coming. And at that point he sat down and drew water falling on the world, because there was nothing else he had ever wanted to do. That is not a lament. That is a man finding out at the end that he had been doing the right thing all along for the wrong reason. You may be in the same position and not know it yet. The thing you have been treating as preparation, the interest you have never managed to convert into an outcome, the subject you keep going back to that has never paid you anything, may not be the runway. It may be the flight. And the 60-year list of unfinished projects attached to it may not be 60 failures. It may be the wake behind a boat that has, all this time, been going somewhere. Chapter 48. The last chapter, which asks nothing. We are at the end, and there is nothing left to explain, so this chapter is only for going to sleep. Let the list stay where it is. It does not need to be carried. Everything on it will still be there in the morning, which is the correct place to look at it, in a good light, with a pen, with the daylight version of you, who is much fairer than the version that is awake now. Nothing is being decided tonight. Nothing has to be. If it helps, put the whole of it down, in order, once, slowly, and then let it go. A boy on a hill, watching water go round a stone. A workshop that smelled of glue and linseed oil. And an angel painted in the corner of somebody else's picture. A panel of kneeling kings that stayed brown. A letter to a duke that mentioned painting ninth. A horse the size of a house, standing in the snow in November, waiting for metal that went to the cannon foundry instead. Gascons with crossbows. A wall in a dining hall painted in a method that allowed him to change his mind, dying slowly ever since. A silver lyre shaped like a horse's skull. A difficult boy who stole things and was kept for 25 years. A map of a town drawn from a viewpoint nobody had ever occupied. A woman with soft corners to her mouth, carried over the Alps in a box. An ox heart, some glass, and grass seeds in swirling water. 13,000 pages in reversed handwriting addressed to nobody. Riddles about cats. Birds let out of cages, possibly. A figure in the dark pointing at something outside the frame. Water coming down over the whole world in black chalk. For no one. That is a life. Not a tidy one. Not a finished one. It is enough. It was always going to be enough. And so is yours, which is smaller and has less bronze in it and is the same shape. Think, if you want something to hold, of the house at Amboise, brick and pale stone, a slate roof a few hundred yards from the river. It is April. The Loire is high and slow, and the light off it comes up onto the ceiling of an upstairs room and moves. An old man is in that room. His hand does not work properly anymore. There is a portrait of a Florentine woman leaning against the wall unfinished, that he has carried over a mountain range and will not give to anyone. There are boxes of paper that nobody will be able to read for 300 years. On the table is a sheet of black chalk drawings of water coming down over the whole world. He is not finishing anything. He never was going to. He is watching the light move on the ceiling because water is doing it. And water has been the most interesting thing in the world to him since he was a boy on a hill, and it still is, and that has never once stopped being true for 60 years. There is nothing unresolved in that room. There is only a man at the end, still interested. You are allowed the same. Not the achievement, the interest, the thing that has been quietly the same in you since you were young, whatever it is, that no unfinished project has ever managed to switch off, and that is still there tonight, underneath the list, waiting for the morning without any urgency at all. Let the day go now. It was spent. That is enough for a day. The light is moving on the ceiling. The river is going past the house in the dark, and it has been going past for 500 years, and it does not need anything from you. Nothing is required. Nothing is required. Sleep now.